Kodiak Bear, mauls fisherman on dock. June 21st, 2025. Kodiak Bear, mauls fisherman on dock. June 21st, 2025. The morning of June 21st, 2025 began like countless others in Larsen Bay, Alaska, with the low rumble of diesel engines and the metallic clank of fishing gear echoing across the harbor. The summer solstice had arrived with its promise of 22 hours of daylight, casting the remote village of 115 souls in an ethereal glow that seemed to suspend time itself. Mike Sanchez had risen at 4:30 a.m., as was his custom during salmon season, his weathered hands already reaching for the thick wool socks that would keep his feet warm in rubber boots that had seen 15 seasons on these waters. Mike Sanchez was 54 years old, a man whose life had been carved from the unforgiving waters of the North Pacific and shaped by decades of hauling nets heavy with silver salmon. Born in Kodiak City to a Filipino father and Aleut mother, he had inherited his father's stocky frame and his mother's intuitive understanding of the sea's moods. His dark hair, now streaked with premature grey from years of salt spray and Arctic wind, was pulled back in a ponytail that hung to his shoulders. 3 deep lines etched themselves across his forehead, testimonies to thousands of hours squinting against the glare of sun on water. His hands, scarred from hooks and rough rope, moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned early that hesitation on a fishing boat could mean the difference between a good catch and an empty hold, or worse, between life and death. The Sanchez family had called Kodiak Island home for 3 generations. Mike's grandfather, Santos Sanchez, had arrived from the Philippines in 1952, drawn by stories of abundant salmon runs and the promise of steady work in the territory's burgeoning fishing industry. He had met Maria Pestrikov, an Aleut woman whose family had fished these waters for centuries before the Russians arrived, at a dance in the old social hall that had since burned down in the Great Fire of 1978. Their son, Miguel, had inherited his father's work ethic and his mother's knowledge of traditional fishing grounds, eventually building the modest fleet of 3 boats that Mike now operated. Mike had been married to Sarah Tungara for 28 years, a union that had produced 2 children and weathered the particular storms that beset fishing families. Sarah, a teacher at the village school, possessed the steady temperament necessary for a fisherman's wife, understanding that her husband's mood would rise and fall with the salmon runs and that some seasons brought feast, while others brought lean months of canned soup and worried conversations held in whispers after the children were asleep. Their daughter Elena, now 25 and living in Anchorage where she worked as a nurse at Providence, Alaska Medical Center, had inherited her mother's practical nature and her father's determination. Their son, David, 22, had followed his father onto the water and was currently running their second boat, the Maria Elena, named for both grandmother and sister. The third boat in their small fleet was the Santos, a 32-foot aluminum seiner that Mike had purchased used from a retiring fisherman in 1998. The Santos had been Mike's primary vessel for 27 years, her hull scarred by countless encounters with rocky shorelines and debris, her diesel engine rebuilt twice and maintained with the obsessive care of a man who understood that mechanical failure 60 miles from shore could be a death sentence. The boat's wheelhouse bore the accumulated patina of years, its windows scratched by salt and sand, its radio equipment updated piecemeal as newer technology became affordable. Charts yellowed with age covered the small table beside the wheel, marked with Mike's careful notations of productive fishing spots, seasonal patterns, and hazards to avoid. On this particular morning, Mike had planned to take the Santos to the productive waters near Uyak Bay, a 20-mile run from Larsen Bay that would put him in position to intercept the sockeye salmon runs that were just beginning to build toward their peak. The weather forecast called for light winds and partly cloudy skies, ideal conditions for the precise maneuvering required to deploy and retrieve the seine net that would hopefully fill his hold with the silver fish that commanded premium prices in the Japanese market. Mike's routine on fishing mornings never varied. After dressing in the layers that would protect him from the cold Pacific air, he would walk the 3 blocks from his small frame house to the harbour, stopping first at the fuel dock to top off his diesel tanks and purchase ice from the harbour master's building. The fuel dock, a weathered wooden structure that had served the village since the 1960s, extended 30 feet into the protected waters of the bay, its planking worn smooth by decades of fishermen's boots and scarred by the metal cleats of countless boats. The harbour master, Tom Alexakov, a burly man in his 60s whose Russian ancestry showed in his prominent cheekbones and pale blue eyes, had been dispensing fuel, ice and weather wisdom to Larsen Bay fishermen for more than 30 years. "Morning, Mike," Tom called out as Mike approached the fuel dock office, a small building whose windows were clouded with salt spray and whose walls were covered with notices about fishing regulations, tide tables, and weather warnings. "Santos going out today?" "That's the plan," Mike replied, pulling his worn leather wallet from the pocket of his Carhartt jacket. "Need to top off and grab some ice. Sarah packed extra sandwiches today, so I might stay out a bit longer if the fish are running." Tom nodded, understanding the economics that drove every decision during salmon season. A good day on the water could mean the difference between making boat payments and falling behind, between having money for Elena's student loans and explaining why the help would have to wait another month. He began pumping diesel fuel into the Santos's twin tanks, while Mike carried 50-pound blocks of ice from the freezer to his boat's hold, arranging them to create the bed of ice that would keep his catch fresh during the long hours ahead. The harbour at Larsen Bay was a testament to the village's dependence on the sea. 23 boats of various sizes rested at their moorings, from small skiffs used for subsistence fishing to the larger seiners and drift boats that formed the backbone of the commercial fleet. The harbour was protected from the worst Pacific storms by a rock breakwater that extended in a gentle curve from the northern shore, creating a sheltered basin where boats could ride out weather that would be dangerous in open water. The docks themselves were constructed of pressure-treated lumber and floated on large foam-filled pontoons that rose and fell with the 8-foot tides that characterized this part of Alaska. As Mike completed his preparations, other fishermen were arriving at the harbor to begin their own days. Robert Panamarioff, known to everyone as Bobby, pulled his battered pickup truck into the gravel parking area beside the harbor master's building. Bobby was 61 years old, a compact man whose Aleut heritage was evident in his dark hair and the weathered bronze of his skin. He had been fishing these waters for 43 years, beginning as a teenager working on his uncle's boat and eventually building his own operation around a 40-foot seiner called the Aleut Pride. Bobby's knowledge of local waters was encyclopedic, his ability to read weather patterns and predict fish behavior bordering on mystical. Other fishermen, including Mike, often watched to see which direction Bobby headed when leaving the harbor, using his choices as a guide for their own fishing plans. "Morning, Bobby," Mike called out as the older man walked past the Santos toward his own boat. "Were you thinking of trying today?" Bobby paused, his pale blue eyes scanning the horizon beyond the harbor mouth. "Thinking about Karluk area. Heard some chatter on the radio yesterday about fish moving in there." He spoke in the economical sentences characteristic of men who had spent decades communicating over scratchy marine radios. "What about you?" "Uyak Bay," Mike replied. "Want to check that spot near the cannery ruins where we did well last year." Bobby nodded approvingly. The ruins of the old Uyak Bay cannery, abandoned since the 1970s, served as a landmark for fishermen and apparently as a gathering point for salmon returning to spawn in the nearby streams. The concrete foundations and rusted machinery that remained above the high tide line created current breaks and eddies that concentrated bait fish, which in turn attracted the salmon that were the lifeblood of the local economy. As the two men talked, David Sanchez's boat, the Maria Elena, rounded the harbor breakwater and approached the fuel dock. David, 22 years old and built like a smaller version of his father, had been out since 3 a.m. checking his setnet sites in nearby Uyak Inlet. The Maria Elena, a 28-foot aluminum boat powered by a single outboard engine, was loaded with salmon that David had picked from his nets during the early morning run. The younger Sanchez had inherited his father's work ethic and his grandfather's intuitive understanding of salmon behavior, but he brought a younger man's willingness to experiment with new techniques and fishing spots. "How'd you do this morning?" Mike called out as David maneuvered his boat alongside the dock. "Not bad," David replied, cutting his engine and tossing a dock line to his father. "Maybe 300 pounds, mostly reds with some chums mixed in. Fish are definitely starting to move." The salmon David referred to as reds were sockeye salmon, prized for their firm red flesh and commanding the highest prices in both commercial and sport fishing markets. Chums were chum salmon, also called dog salmon, which brought lower prices but still contributed significantly to a fisherman's income during the brief but intense summer season. The timing and abundance of these runs determined the economic fate of villages like Larsen Bay, where nearly every family depended either directly or indirectly on commercial fishing for their livelihood. While David unloaded his catch into plastic totes filled with ice, Mike completed his own preparations for the day ahead. The Santos carried a seine net that measured 250 fathoms in length and 15 fathoms in depth, constructed of monofilament mesh designed to encircle schools of salmon in open water. The net was stored on a large reel at the stern of the boat, with hydraulic power to deploy and retrieve it. Successful seining required precise timing and boat handling, skills that Mike had developed over decades of practice, and that could mean the difference between a successful set and a costly tangle of net and fish. By 6:30 a.m., Mike had completed his preparations and was ready to depart for Uyak Bay. The Santos's engine, a Caterpillar 3208 diesel that had been rebuilt 18 months earlier, turned over immediately and settled into the steady rumble that would carry him through the day ahead. Mike cast off his dock lines and maneuvered slowly through the harbor, following the channel markers that guided boats safely past the shoal water near the breakwater entrance. The waters outside Larsen Bay stretched away in all directions, an expanse of dark blue ocean that reflected the cloudy sky above. To the southwest, the peaks of the Aleutian Range rose from the water, their snow-covered summits catching the early morning light. To the northeast, Kodiak Island's mountainous interior disappeared into low-hanging clouds that promised rain later in the day. The forecast had called for partly cloudy conditions, with winds from the southeast at 10 to 15 knots, ideal for the precise boat handling required for successful seining. As Mike throttled up to cruising speed and pointed the Santos toward Uyak Bay, he settled into the rhythm that had characterized thousands of similar trips. The boat's GPS unit showed his position as a small arrow moving across an electronic chart, while the fish finder display revealed the underwater topography passing beneath the hull. Mike's practiced eye scanned both instruments and the water around him, looking for the subtle signs that might indicate the presence of salmon, diving seabirds, surface disturbances, or the telltale shadows beneath the surface that experienced fishermen learned to recognize. The trip to Uyak Bay took 45 minutes at the Santos's cruising speed of 12 knots. As Mike approached the fishing grounds, he began to see other boats already working the area. The Sina Alaska Dream, owned by Paul and Jennifer Morrison, was completing a set near the mouth of Uyak Creek, her crew working to purse the net closed around what appeared to be a good concentration of fish. Further offshore, two other boats were maneuvering into position for their own sets, their movements coordinated by marine radio communications that followed the unwritten protocols developed over decades of shared fishing grounds. Mike selected a spot approximately half a mile southwest of the old cannery ruins, where his fish finder indicated bottom structure that might concentrate salmon. The ruins themselves were visible from his position, concrete walls and rusted machinery that had once processed thousands of tons of salmon during the industry's peak years in the mid-20th century. Now they served primarily as landmarks for fishermen and occasional curiosities for the tourists who arrived on charter boats during the summer months. At 7:45 a.m., Mike made his first set of the day. The process of deploying a seine net required precise timing and boat handling, beginning with the release of the skiff that would hold one end of the net while the Santos steamed in a large circle to surround any fish in the area. Mike worked alone, as did many of the smaller operators, relying on hydraulic systems and years of experience to handle tasks that larger boats accomplished with crews of 3 or 4 people. The first set produced disappointing results. Only 30 salmon, mostly chums with a few sockeyes mixed in. Mike carefully removed the fish from the net and placed them in the Santos's hold, covering them with ice to maintain the quality that commanded premium prices. The low numbers suggested that the main body of fish had not yet arrived in the area, but Mike was patient, understanding that salmon runs could change quickly and that early morning disappointment might give way to afternoon success. By 10:30 a.m., Mike had completed 3 more sets with similarly modest results. The total catch for the morning stood at 127 salmon, enough to cover the cost of fuel and ice, but far short of the kind of day that would make a significant dent in the boat payments and family expenses that drove his calculations. He decided to move closer to the cannery ruins, where the underwater structure might be concentrating fish that had moved into the area since his arrival. The waters near the cannery ruins held particular significance for Mike and other local fishermen. The area had been fished by Alaska Native peoples for thousands of years before the arrival of commercial operations, with archaeological evidence suggesting that salmon had been harvested here using traditional methods for at least 3 millennia. The cannery itself had operated from 1926 to 1976, processing an average of 2.3 million salmon annually during its peak years and employing as many as 150 workers during the summer season. The cannery's closure in 1976 had devastated Larsen Bay's economy, eliminating the primary source of employment and forcing many families to relocate to larger communities where work might be available. Those who remained, including Mike's family, had adapted by transitioning to independent commercial fishing operations, selling their catch to processors in Kodiak City or directly to buyers who traveled to the remote villages during salmon season. As Mike approached the ruins for his 5th set of the day, he noticed increased activity among the seabirds working the area. Murres, cormorants and gulls were diving actively near the old cannery dock, their behavior indicating the presence of baitfish and likely salmon as well. The dock itself, constructed of massive concrete pilings and steel decking, had survived 50 years of storms and tides, though portions had collapsed and much of the steel showed advanced corrosion from decades of saltwater exposure. At 11:15 a.m., Mike began what would prove to be his most successful set of the day. As the Santos steamed in a wide circle with the net paying out behind her, Mike could see salmon jumping inside the area being enclosed, their silver bodies flashing in the late morning sunlight. When he began pursing the net closed, the hydraulic system strained against the weight of fish, and Mike felt the familiar surge of excitement that accompanied a good set. The net yielded 847 salmon, predominantly sockeyes, with their distinctive red bodies and green heads, mixed with smaller numbers of chums and a few early kings that had strayed from their usual runs. Mike worked steadily to extract the fish from the net, using a dip net to transfer them to the Santos's hold, where they joined the morning's earlier catch. The process took nearly 2 hours, and by the time Mike had the net back aboard and the fish properly iced, it was past 1:30 p.m. The successful set had transformed the day from marginal to profitable, but Mike decided to try for one more set before beginning the journey back to Larsen Bay. Salmon runs were unpredictable, and a fisherman who stopped too early might miss the peak of the action. He moved the Santos to a position slightly northeast of the ruins, where the depth finder showed an underwater ledge that often held fish. As Mike prepared for his 6th set of the day, he monitored the marine radio traffic that provided a constant background of information about fishing conditions throughout the area. Other boats were reporting good fishing near Karluk, where Bobby Panamarioff was working, and moderate success in several other locations around Kodiak Island. The radio chatter also included weather updates from the National Weather Service office in Kodiak City, which was forecasting deteriorating conditions late in the day with increasing winds and possible rain. At 2:20 p.m., Mike deployed his net for what he intended to be his final set of the day. The circle he steamed was smaller than his previous efforts, targeting a specific piece of structure that his fish finder had identified as potentially productive. As he began to purse the net, Mike could see that he had again enclosed a substantial number of fish, though fewer than his previous successful set. The net yielded 623 salmon, bringing his total for the day to 1,650 fish, weighing approximately 8,250 pounds. It was a good day by any measure, enough to cover his expenses and provide a substantial contribution to the family income. As Mike secured the net and prepared for the trip back to Larsen Bay, he felt the satisfaction that came from successfully reading the water and timing his efforts to coincide with the salmon's movements. The return trip to Larsen Bay began at 4:45 p.m., with the Santos loaded deep with fish and riding noticeably lower in the water than she had that morning. Mike maintained a steady speed of 10 knots, slightly slower than his outbound pace to account for the additional weight and the sea conditions that had built during the afternoon. The wind had increased as forecast, creating a choppy surface that required careful attention to avoid slamming into the wave faces. As the Santos approached Larsen Bay, Mike could see several other boats returning from their own fishing efforts, their progress marked by the white wakes they left on the darkening water. The village itself appeared small and isolated against the backdrop of mountains and forest. Its collection of houses and buildings clustered around the harbor that served as the community's lifeline to the outside world. Mike entered Larsen Bay Harbor at 5:30 p.m., maneuvering the heavily loaded Santos carefully through the channel between the breakwater ends. The harbor was busier than it had been that morning, with boats that had returned earlier preparing for the next day's fishing and crew members unloading catches and servicing equipment. The wooden docks creaked under the weight of men and equipment, and the air carried the familiar mixture of diesel fumes, fish, and salt water that characterized fishing communities throughout Alaska. Instead of proceeding directly to his usual berth at the main dock, Mike decided to stop at the cannery dock to clean his catch before going home. The cannery dock, a smaller wooden structure located on the western side of the harbor, was equipped with running water and cleaning tables that made the job of processing fish more efficient than working aboard the boat. The dock was also somewhat isolated from the main harbor activity, providing a quieter environment for the careful work of cleaning and sorting fish. The cannery dock had been constructed in the 1980s to serve the small processing operation that had briefly replaced the old cannery after its closure. When that operation failed in 1992, the dock had become a public facility used by local fishermen for cleaning their catches and servicing their equipment. The structure consisted of a single floating dock, approximately 60 feet long and 12 feet wide, connected to shore by a fixed walkway that rose and fell with the tides. At high tide, as it was when Mike arrived, the dock floated approximately 6 feet above the water level, with the walkway at a gentle angle that made it easy to move equipment and fish between boats and shore. The dock was equipped with 4 fish cleaning stations, each consisting of a stainless steel table with running water and electrical outlets for equipment. Overhead lighting, added in 2019, allowed fishermen to work after dark during the long summer days when fishing might continue well into the evening hours. Mike maneuvered the Santos alongside the dock and secured her with dock lines fore and aft. The boat settled slightly as the weight of the fish and fuel shifted, but remained stable against the dock's fenders. Mike shut down the engine and began the process of unloading his catch onto the cleaning tables, where he would sort the fish by species and size before packing them in ice for transport to the processors. The work of cleaning and sorting 1,650 salmon was substantial, requiring several hours of steady effort. Mike began by setting up his equipment on the cleaning table closest to where the Santos was moored. Sharp fillet knives, plastic totes for different grades of fish, and the hose that would provide fresh water for cleaning. The process required careful attention to detail, as buyers paid different prices for fish based on species, size, and condition. As Mike worked, the afternoon light began to fade toward the extended twilight that characterized Alaska's summer solstice. The harbor gradually quieted as other fishermen completed their own unloading and headed home for dinner with their families. By 7:30 p.m., Mike was alone on the cannery dock, working steadily through his catch under the overhead lights that cast stark shadows on the wooden planking. The isolation of the cannery dock, which had seemed appealing when Mike arrived, now contributed to a growing sense of vulnerability that he couldn't quite define. The wooden structure creaked and shifted with the movement of the water beneath it, and the shadows cast by the overhead lights seemed to conceal more than they revealed. Mike found himself glancing frequently toward the tree line that bordered the harbor, though he couldn't have explained what he was looking for. Kodiak Island was home to the largest concentration of brown bears in North America, with an estimated population of 3,500 animals distributed across the island's 3,588 square miles. The bears, scientifically classified as Ursus arctos middendorfi, were the largest subspecies of brown bear in the world, with adult males commonly weighing 1,000 to 1,200 pounds and exceptional individuals reaching 1,500 pounds or more. The abundance of salmon during the summer months provided the high-protein diet that allowed Kodiak bears to reach these massive sizes. The bears' relationship with salmon was fundamental to their ecology and behavior. During the peak of the salmon runs, individual bears might consume up to 30 fish per day, gaining as much as 4 pounds of body weight daily as they prepared for the winter months when food would be scarce. This intense feeding behavior brought bears into proximity with human activities related to fishing, creating the potential for dangerous encounters. Larsen Bay, located on the southwestern coast of Kodiak Island, sat directly in the path of salmon returning to spawn in several major river systems. The village's location made it inevitable that bears would pass through the area during their seasonal movements, and residents had developed protocols for minimizing dangerous encounters. These included proper storage of fish and garbage, making noise when moving through areas of limited visibility, and maintaining awareness of bear activity reported by other community members. Despite these precautions, encounters between bears and humans occurred with troubling regularity. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game maintained detailed records of bear incidents throughout the state, documenting an average of 25 serious encounters annually between humans and brown bears in the Kodiak area alone. Most encounters resulted in the bear withdrawing when confronted by humans, but a significant minority escalated to attacks that caused serious injury or death. The factors that contributed to dangerous bear encounters were well understood by wildlife biologists and enforcement officers. Bears defending cubs or food sources were particularly dangerous, as were bears that had become habituated to human presence through repeated exposure to fish cleaning sites, garbage dumps, or other attractants. Individual bears that had learned to associate human activity with food sources posed ongoing risks to human safety and often had to be destroyed by wildlife authorities. As Mike continued cleaning his catch on the isolated cannery dock, his movements and the smell of fresh fish were creating exactly the conditions that wildlife experts identified as high risk for bear encounters. The cleaning process involved cutting fish and allowing blood and offal to wash into the water below the dock, creating scent trails that could attract bears from considerable distances. The overhead lights that allowed Mike to work after dark also eliminated the natural caution that both bears and humans might exercise during periods of limited visibility. At 8:45 p.m., as Mike was finishing the last of his fish cleaning, he heard a sound from the forest that bordered the harbor. It was a deep huffing noise, barely audible above the ambient sounds of water lapping against the dock and the distant hum of generators in the village. Mike paused in his work, listening intently, but the sound was not repeated. After a moment, he resumed cleaning the final salmon in his catch, attributing the noise to the wind in the trees or perhaps a boat engine in the distance. The sound Mike had heard was the breathing of a large male brown bear that had been drawn to the cannery dock by the smell of fish blood and offal. The bear, an adult male weighing approximately 1,100 pounds, had emerged from the forest approximately 200 yards from the dock and was testing the air with his sensitive nose. The bear's sense of smell was roughly 7 times more acute than that of a dog, allowing him to detect the scent of fish from miles away and to track the source with remarkable precision. This particular bear, identified by wildlife biologists as Bear 447 based on the numbered ear tag he carried, had a history of problematic interactions with humans. Over the previous 3 years, he had been trapped and relocated twice after incidents involving garbage and fish cleaning areas in other villages on Kodiak Island. Each relocation had moved him progressively farther from human settlements, but bears possessed remarkable homing abilities, and Bear 447 had returned to areas of human activity within weeks of each release. The bear's behavior pattern, documented in files maintained by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, showed an escalating willingness to approach human activity in pursuit of food sources. Initial encounters had involved the bear fleeing when confronted by humans, but more recent incidents had shown increasing boldness and aggression. Wildlife biologists had classified Bear 447 as a problem bear whose continued presence near human settlements posed an unacceptable risk to public safety. The protocols for dealing with problem bears were clearly established and strictly followed by Alaska wildlife authorities. Bears that showed repeated patterns of dangerous behavior were typically destroyed rather than relocated, as relocation had proven ineffective in modifying behavior and often simply transferred the problem to other communities. Bear 447 had avoided this fate only because his previous incidents had not resulted in human injury and because the remote location of his activities had limited the number of people at risk. As Bear 447 approached the cannery dock, his massive frame moved with the surprising stealth that characterized all members of his species. Despite weighing more than half a ton, the bear's padded feet made virtually no sound on the forest floor, and his dark brown coat blended seamlessly with the shadows cast by the spruce and hemlock trees that surrounded the harbor. The bear's approach was methodical and purposeful, following the scent trail that led directly to where Mike continued working under the bright dock lights. At 9:10 p.m., Bear 447 reached the edge of the forest and stood at the tree line, approximately 75 yards from where Mike was cleaning the last fish from his catch. The bear remained motionless for several minutes, assessing the situation with the intelligence that had allowed his species to survive as apex predators for thousands of years. The bear could see Mike moving under the lights, could smell the fresh fish blood, and could hear the splash of water as Mike rinsed his cleaning table. Mike, focused on completing his work so he could finally head home to Sarah and a late dinner, remained unaware of the predator watching him from the darkness. The overhead lights that illuminated his work area also destroyed his night vision, making it impossible for him to see beyond the circle of artificial illumination. The constant sound of water against the dock and the hum of the light's electrical transformer masked any subtle sounds that might have alerted him to danger. The bear's decision to approach closer was influenced by several factors that wildlife experts had identified as contributing to aggressive behavior. The isolation of the dock meant that the bear perceived no immediate threat from other humans who might intervene. The abundance of fish scent suggested a rich food source that would be worth the risk of approaching human activity. Most importantly, Bear 447's previous encounters with humans had taught him that people often fled when confronted, leaving behind food sources that could be claimed without significant resistance. At 9:18 p.m., Bear 447 began moving toward the dock, abandoning the stealth that had characterized his approach and adopting the confident gait of a dominant predator claiming territory. The bear emerged from the tree line and crossed the open ground between the forest and the harbor, his massive bulk clearly visible to anyone who might have been watching from the village. However, the cannery dock's location on the western side of the harbor, partially screened by buildings and equipment, meant that Mike's activities were not visible from most of the village. Mike first became aware of the bear's presence at 9:22 p.m., when a sound like heavy footsteps on gravel caused him to look up from his work. What he saw was a sight that would haunt the survivors of that evening for the rest of their lives. A massive brown bear walking directly toward the dock with the purposeful stride of an animal that had no intention of being deterred. The bear was still approximately 50 yards away when Mike first spotted him, but closing the distance with surprising speed. Mike's initial reaction was disbelief, his mind struggling to process the reality of what he was seeing. Bears were a constant concern in Alaska, but actual encounters were rare enough that many residents went years without seeing one in the wild. The sudden appearance of such a massive predator seemed almost surreal, like something from a nightmare rather than reality. Mike's training and experience as an Alaskan fisherman quickly overcame his initial shock. He knew that running from a bear was the worst possible response, likely to trigger the animal's chase instinct and guarantee an attack. Instead, he began backing slowly toward the Santos, while making noise in an attempt to frighten the bear away. "Hey, bear!" he shouted, his voice carrying across the water. "Go on! Get out of here!" The bear showed no sign of being deterred by Mike's shouts. If anything, the animal seemed to interpret the noise as confirmation that humans were present at the source of the fish scent that had drawn him to the dock. Bear 447 continued his approach at a steady pace, his small dark eyes fixed on Mike with the intensity of a predator that had identified potential prey. Mike reached the edge of the dock and stepped aboard the Santos, hoping that the boat would provide protection from the approaching bear. However, the dock lines that secured the boat to the dock also limited his options for escape, and the Santos's diesel engine would require several minutes to warm up before he could safely navigate away from the dock. As Mike fumbled for the boat's ignition key, he kept his eyes on the bear, which had now reached the beginning of the wooden walkway that connected the dock to shore. The walkway that Bear 447 began climbing was approximately 30 feet long and rose at a gradual angle from the shore to the floating dock. The structure was designed to accommodate the dramatic tides that characterize this part of Alaska, but it had never been intended to support the weight of a 1,100-pound bear. As the animal's massive paws struck the wooden planking, the entire structure groaned and flexed under the unprecedented load. Mike's calls for help began as the bear reached the midpoint of the walkway. "Help! Bear on the dock! Someone call fish and game!" His voice carried across the harbor toward the village, but the distance and the ambient noise of wind and water limited its effectiveness. The nearest occupied building was the harbor master's office, approximately 150 yards away. But Tom Alexakov had gone home for dinner at 6 p.m., and the building was now dark and empty. The bear's progress up the walkway was steady and unstoppable. Each step brought the massive predator closer to the dock where Mike stood beside the Santos, frantically trying to start the boat's engine while keeping watch on the approaching threat. The Caterpillar diesel turned over twice but failed to start, its cold engine requiring more time to build the oil pressure necessary for ignition. At 9:25 p.m., Bear 447 reached the floating dock, his massive frame causing the entire structure to sink noticeably lower in the water. The bear paused at the edge of the dock, standing on his hind legs to test the air with his sensitive nose. At full height, the animal stood nearly 9 feet tall, his massive head and shoulders silhouetted against the evening sky. From this position, the bear could see Mike clearly, could smell the fresh fish blood that covered his hands and clothes, and could assess the floating platform that lay between him and his intended target. Mike had managed to get the Santos's engine started, but the boat remained tied to the dock by 2 heavy dock lines that would have to be cast off before he could escape. The process of untying the lines would require him to leave the boat's controls and move within reach of the bear, a risk that seemed too great to accept. Instead, Mike grabbed the marine radio microphone and began broadcasting a distress call. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is the Santos in Larsen Bay. I have a large brown bear on the dock and need immediate assistance. Anyone monitoring this frequency, please respond." The marine radio transmission was received by several boats in the area, including David Sanchez aboard the Maria Elena, who was approaching Larsen Bay from his afternoon fishing trip. David immediately responded to his father's distress call, but his boat was still more than 2 miles from the harbor and would require at least 10 minutes to reach the dock. "Santos, this is Maria Elena. I copy your mayday. I'm approximately 2 miles out and coming to assist. Can you get off the dock?" "Negative," Mike replied, his voice tight with stress. "The bear is between me and the shore. I'm trapped on the boat." The radio traffic alerted other members of the fishing community to the emergency situation developing at the cannery dock. Bobby Panamarioff, who had returned from his fishing trip and was working on equipment at his boat, immediately contacted the village public safety officer on his handheld radio. However, Larsen Bay's single law enforcement officer was attending a training seminar in Kodiak City and would not return until the following day. As word of the emergency spread through the village, several residents began gathering equipment and vehicles to respond to the dock. However, none of the villagers possessed the specialized training or equipment necessary to safely confront a large brown bear, and their good intentions could easily make the situation more dangerous for Mike. Bear 447's behavior on the dock showed the calculated intelligence that made brown bears such formidable predators. Rather than immediately charging toward Mike and the boat, the animal began investigating the fish cleaning station where Mike had been working. The bear could smell the concentrated scent of fish blood and offal, and his sensitive nose directed him to the cleaning table where substantial amounts of organic material remained. The bear's investigation of the cleaning station provided Mike with a brief respite, but also eliminated any possibility of escape via the dock. The animal's massive bulk blocked the walkway to shore, and his position near the cleaning station put him directly between Mike and any route of escape that didn't involve entering the water. Mike considered jumping overboard and swimming to safety, but the water temperature in Larsen Bay during late June was approximately 48 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to incapacitate an unprotected person within minutes. The distance to shore was manageable for a strong swimmer, but Mike would have to navigate around the dock structure while wearing heavy fishing gear that would severely limit his mobility in the water. At 9:28 p.m., Bear 447 completed his investigation of the cleaning station and turned his attention toward Mike and the Santos. The bear's body language had changed during his exploration of the dock, transitioning from the cautious approach of an animal investigating a potential food source to the confident posture of a predator that had claimed territory and was prepared to defend it. Mike recognized the change in the bear's demeanor and realized that his situation had become critical. The animal was no longer simply investigating the area. He was actively stalking Mike as potential prey. The bear's head was lowered in the classic posture of an animal preparing to charge, and his small, dark eyes remained fixed on Mike with unwavering intensity. "Santos, this is Harbor Master responding to your emergency." Tom Alexikov's voice crackled over the marine radio as he transmitted from his pickup truck while racing toward the harbor. "I'm 2 minutes out with my rifle. Can you hold your position?" Mike's response was interrupted by the bear's sudden movement. At 9:29 p.m., Bear 447 began walking along the dock toward the Santos, his massive paws making the wooden structure creak and sway with each step. The bear's approach was deliberate but not hurried, the behavior of a confident predator that had identified its target and was closing in for the kill. The distance between the bear and the Santos was approximately 20 feet when Mike made the decision that would determine whether he lived or died. Rather than remaining on the boat where he would eventually be cornered, Mike chose to dive into the frigid water of Larsen Bay, hoping to swim to safety before the cold water incapacitated him. Mike's dive from the Santos occurred at 9:30 p.m., his body hitting the 48-degree water with a shock that drove the breath from his lungs and sent his heart rate soaring. The cold water immediately began sapping his body heat and energy, but adrenaline and desperation drove him to begin swimming toward the shore with powerful strokes that carried him away from the dock and the bear. Bear 447's reaction to Mike's entry into the water demonstrated the predatory instincts that had made brown bears Alaska's apex land predator. Rather than being deterred by Mike's escape into the water, the bear was actually stimulated by the movement and the scent of fear that now permeated the area. The animal's hunting instincts, dormant during his investigation of the dock, were now fully activated. The bear's decision to enter the water in pursuit of Mike was based on millions of years of evolutionary programming that identified fleeing prey as an opportunity to be pursued. Brown bears were excellent swimmers, capable of covering substantial distances in water and of catching salmon with remarkable efficiency. The prospect of pursuing a human into the water triggered the same predatory response that the bear would exhibit when hunting salmon or other aquatic prey. At 9:31 p.m., Bear 447 dove from the dock into Larsen Bay, his massive body creating a splash that sent waves across the harbor. The bear's entry into the water marked the transition from a dangerous encounter to a life-or-death struggle that would test both the physical capabilities and the survival instincts of predator and prey. Mike had gained approximately 30 yards from the dock when he heard the splash of the bear entering the water behind him. The sound sent a surge of terror through his already stressed system, providing additional adrenaline that temporarily overcame the effects of the cold water. Mike increased his swimming pace using a modified crawl stroke that maximized his speed while conserving energy for what he now realized would be a prolonged struggle for survival. The physics of the chase heavily favored the bear. While Mike was an experienced swimmer who had spent his life around water, he was wearing heavy fishing gear that created drag and limited his mobility. The bear, in contrast, was perfectly adapted for swimming, with a body design that provided both power and buoyancy in the water. Brown bears had been observed swimming distances of up to 6 miles in Alaska's coastal waters, demonstrating endurance that far exceeded human capabilities. Bear 447's swimming technique was a modified dog paddle that utilized the animal's powerful front legs to pull his massive body through the water while his rear legs provided steering and stability. The bear's swimming speed was approximately 4 miles per hour, compared to Mike's maximum speed of approximately 2 miles per hour while wearing fishing gear. The bear was gaining on his prey with each stroke. Mike's strategy as he swam away from the dock was to reach the rocky shoreline approximately 100 yards away, where he hoped to find terrain that would favor his smaller size and greater agility. Bears were capable climbers, but the rocky coastline offered numerous crevices and overhangs that might provide temporary refuge until help arrived. However, the distance to shore seemed to increase with each stroke as the cold water sapped his strength, and the bear continued to close the gap between them. Tom Alexikoff arrived at the harbor at 9:33 p.m., his pickup truck sliding to a stop in the gravel parking area beside the harbor master's building. Tom could see the emergency unfolding in the water as he grabbed his .375 H&H rifle from the truck's gun rack and ran toward the shore. The rifle was a powerful hunting weapon designed specifically for large game, but the darkness and the distance to the swimming figures made an accurate shot extremely difficult. "Mike, I'm here with a rifle!" Tom shouted across the water, hoping to provide some encouragement to the struggling fisherman. However, Tom's position on shore put him at the wrong angle to safely fire at the bear without risking hitting Mike, who was directly in the line of fire. The harbor master was forced to watch helplessly as the drama unfolded in the dark water. David Sanchez's boat, the Maria Elena, rounded the harbor breakwater at 9:34 p.m., her diesel engine at full throttle as David raced to reach his father. From his position in the boat's wheelhouse, David could see 2 figures in the water near the cannery dock, one clearly human and the other unmistakably a large bear. The sight of his father swimming for his life while being pursued by a massive predator filled David with a mixture of terror and rage that overcame his normal caution. David's plan was to maneuver the Maria Elena between the bear and his father, using the boat's propeller wash and engine noise to discourage the animal from continuing its pursuit. However, the maneuver would have to be executed with extreme precision to avoid injuring Mike while still affecting the bear's behavior. A mistake in boat handling could easily result in striking either the bear or Mike with the boat's hull or propeller. As David approached the swimming figures, the proximity of the bear to his father became terrifyingly apparent. Bear 447 was now within 10 yards of Mike, close enough that David could see the animal's massive head and the V-shaped wake created by his swimming. Mike's swimming had slowed noticeably, his strokes becoming less coordinated as hypothermia and exhaustion began to affect his motor control. The water temperature of 48 degrees Fahrenheit was approaching the threshold for immediate incapacitation, particularly for someone wearing the heavy clothing and gear that characterized commercial fishing operations. Mike's body was losing heat approximately 25 times faster than it would in air of the same temperature, and his core body temperature was beginning to drop toward levels that would compromise his ability to swim or even remain conscious. Mike's awareness of his deteriorating condition added psychological stress to the physical challenges he was facing. He could feel his coordination declining and his strength ebbing, while the sound of the bears swimming behind him served as a constant reminder that his pursuer was not experiencing similar difficulties. The realization that he might not be able to swim much farther filled Mike with desperation that temporarily restored some of his strength. At 9:35 p.m., as Bear 447 closed to within 5 yards of Mike, the bear's massive front paw struck Mike's leg in the first physical contact between predator and prey. The bear's claws, each approximately 4 inches long and designed for digging and fighting, raked across Mike's thigh and calf, creating deep lacerations that immediately began bleeding into the dark water. The pain from the bear's claws was intense, but secondary to the terror of physical contact with the massive predator. Mike's response was to kick frantically with both legs, hoping to strike the bear in the face or nose and discourage further contact. His kicks connected with the bear's head several times, but the animal's thick skull and aggressive state made him largely immune to the impacts. Bear 447's reaction to Mike's resistance was to increase his own aggression, interpreting the kicking as fighting behavior that required a proportional response. The bear's front paws began striking at Mike with increasing frequency and force, each blow driving him underwater and making it increasingly difficult to maintain position on the surface. David Sanchez's boat reached the swimming figures at 9:36 p.m., her bow wave washing over both Mike and the bear as David attempted to position the Maria Elena between them. The boat's proximity and engine noise caused Bear 447 to hesitate momentarily, but the animal's pursuit instincts were too strong to be overcome by the mechanical sounds. "Dad, grab the rail!" David shouted as he maneuvered the boat's port side toward his father's position. The Maria Elena's low freeboard made it theoretically possible for Mike to grab the boat's rail and pull himself aboard, but his position in the water and his declining strength made the maneuver extremely difficult. Mike's attempt to reach the Maria Elena's rail was interrupted by another strike from the bear's massive paw, this one catching him across the back and shoulder with enough force to drive him completely underwater. The blow opened additional lacerations and created internal injuries that would prove significant in the struggle ahead. Mike surfaced gasping and disoriented, his vision blurred by water and his breathing labored from the combination of cold water and physical trauma. Bear 447's behavior in the water demonstrated the relentless nature that made brown bears such effective predators. Despite the presence of the boat and the shouting of the humans, the animal continued his pursuit of Mike with single-minded determination. The bear's powerful strokes carried him around the Maria Elena's stern as David attempted to keep the boat between the predator and his father. The maneuvering of boat, swimmer, and bear created a complex three-dimensional puzzle that David had to solve while operating his vessel in close proximity to both his father and a dangerous wild animal. The risk of striking either Mike or the bear with the boat's propeller was constant, requiring precise throttle control and steering inputs that challenged even David's considerable boat handling skills. Mike's second attempt to reach the Maria Elena's rail was more successful, his desperate fingers managing to grasp the boat's gunwale as David brought the vessel within arm's reach. However, Mike's strength had been so depleted by cold water and blood loss that he could not pull his own weight from the water, and David's position at the boat's controls made it impossible for him to assist directly. "I can't pull myself up," Mike gasped, his voice barely audible above the sound of the boat's engine and the splashing of the bear in the water nearby. "I need help." David's dilemma was agonizing. Maintaining control of the boat required his constant attention, but his father clearly needed assistance to get out of the water before the bear resumed his attack. The decision to leave the controls and help his father meant risking loss of control of the Maria Elena, potentially putting all three of them in greater danger. Bear 447 resolved David's dilemma by resuming his attack with renewed intensity. The bear's massive bulk surged through the water toward Mike's position at the boat's rail, his front paws extended to grasp the prey that had nearly escaped. The bear's approach was so aggressive that David was forced to gun the engine and pull away from his father to avoid having the animal climb aboard the Maria Elena. The separation of Mike from the boat left him floating in the dark water with no protection from the approaching bear. Mike's strength was nearly exhausted. His body temperature was dropping toward critical levels, and his injuries were bleeding steadily into the water around him. The situation had deteriorated to the point where survival seemed increasingly unlikely. At 9:38 p.m., Bear 447 reached Mike's position and began what wildlife experts would later classify as a sustained predatory attack. The bear's massive front paws struck Mike repeatedly, driving him underwater and preventing him from maintaining position on the surface. Each blow from the bear's paws opened new lacerations and compounded the internal injuries that Mike was sustaining. The bear's attack in the water differed significantly from the defensive swatting that characterized most bear encounters on land. Instead of brief aggressive displays designed to drive away threats, Bear 447 was exhibiting the sustained predatory behavior that brown bears used when hunting salmon or other aquatic prey. The animal's goal was not simply to drive Mike away, but to disable and kill him as food. Mike's ability to defend himself was severely limited by his position in the water and his declining physical condition. The heavy fishing gear that had saved his life in numerous storms and emergencies now became a liability, creating drag that slowed his movements and made it impossible to dive away from the bear's attacks. His attempts to strike back at the bear were weakened by cold water and blood loss. Tom Alexakov, watching from shore with his rifle, faced an impossible shooting situation. The darkness, the movement of both targets in the water, and the risk of hitting Mike made any shot extremely dangerous. Tom's experience as a hunter told him that a wounded bear would be even more dangerous than an unwounded one, and a missed shot might drive the animal to even greater aggression. David Sanchez's attempts to rescue his father using the Maria Elena were frustrated by the bear's relentless pursuit and the risk of injuring Mike with the boat's propeller. Each time David maneuvered close enough for Mike to reach the boat, the bear would renew his attack, forcing David to pull away to avoid having the animal board the vessel. The sound of the attack carried across the harbor to the village, where residents were beginning to gather with whatever equipment they could quickly assemble. However, the nearest boat capable of responding was still several minutes away, and the specialized equipment needed to safely deal with a bear attack was not available in the small community. At 9:40 p.m., Bear 447's sustained attack began to have its intended effect. Mike's movements in the water became increasingly uncoordinated, as blood loss and hypothermia combined to shut down his body's systems. His attempts to swim away from the bear became weaker and less directed, and his ability to surface after being driven underwater began to fail. The bear's claws inflicted massive damage with each strike. The front claws of an adult brown bear could measure up to 4 inches in length and were powered by muscles capable of breaking the necks of animals as large as moose. When these weapons struck human flesh, the results were devastating, creating lacerations that severed muscles, damaged organs, and caused rapid blood loss. Mike's injuries accumulated with terrible efficiency as the bear's attack continued. Deep lacerations across his back and shoulders damaged the muscles that controlled his arm movements, making it increasingly difficult to swim or defend himself. Strikes to his torso created internal bleeding that accelerated his slide toward unconsciousness. Wounds to his legs compromised his ability to kick and maintain position in the water. The physiological effects of cold water immersion compounded the trauma caused by the bear's attack. Mike's core body temperature had dropped to approximately 90 degrees Fahrenheit, triggering the early stages of severe hypothermia. His heart rate had increased dramatically as his cardiovascular system struggled to maintain circulation to his vital organs while coping with massive blood loss. David Sanchez's desperate attempts to reach his father continued, despite the obvious futility of his efforts. The young fisherman pushed the Maria Elena to her limits, using every technique he had learned during his years on the water to position the boat for a rescue attempt. However, the bear's aggression and Mike's declining condition made each attempt more dangerous than the last. At 9:42 p.m., Mike Sanchez lost consciousness while floating in the dark water of Larsen Bay. The combination of blood loss, hypothermia, and physical trauma had overwhelmed his body's ability to maintain awareness and motor control. His unconscious form continued to float face down in the water, supported by the buoyancy of his fishing gear, but no longer capable of breathing. Bear 447's attack continued even after Mike lost consciousness, the animal's predatory instincts driving him to ensure that his prey was completely disabled. The bear's massive paws continued to strike the unconscious fisherman, adding to the already extensive injuries but no longer encountering any resistance. David Sanchez's realization that his father was no longer moving in the water marked the moment when rescue became recovery. The young man's anguished cries carried across the harbor as he finally understood that he was too late to save the man who had taught him everything he knew about fishing and life on the water. Tom Alexikov's rifle shot finally came at 9:43 p.m. The .375 H&H Magnum round-striking Bear 447 in the shoulder and spinning the massive animal around in the water. The shot, fired from a distance of approximately 150 yards in poor light, was not immediately fatal, but succeeded in driving the bear away from Mike's unconscious form. The wounded bear's reaction to being shot was to swim rapidly toward shore, his powerful strokes carrying him away from the scene of the attack despite the significant injury he had sustained. Bear 447 reached the rocky shoreline and disappeared into the forest, leaving behind a scene of devastation that would haunt the community of Larsen Bay for years to come. David Sanchez maneuvered the Maria Elena to his father's position and managed to pull Mike's unconscious form from the water with the assistance of two other fishermen who had arrived in response to the emergency radio calls. Mike's injuries were immediately apparent as his limp body was lifted onto the boat's deck. Massive lacerations covered his back, shoulders, arms, and legs, and his breathing was barely perceptible. The recovery of Mike's body from the water began the second phase of the emergency response, as the focus shifted from rescue to medical treatment and evacuation. However, the extent of Mike's injuries and the remote location of Larsen Bay meant that advanced medical care was hours away, assuming that Mike could be stabilized for transport. David's emergency radio call to the Coast Guard station in Kodiak City initiated the medical evacuation process, but the logistics of reaching Larsen Bay and transporting a critically injured patient would challenge the resources of Alaska's emergency response system. The nearest hospital with trauma capabilities was Providence Alaska Medical Center in Anchorage, approximately 250 miles away by air. The Maria Elena's race back to the main harbor with Mike's unconscious form aboard took less than 5 minutes, but seemed like hours to David as he watched his father's condition continue to deteriorate. Mike's breathing became increasingly shallow and irregular, and his skin took on the grayish pallor that indicated severe blood loss and shock. The harbor at Larsen Bay had been transformed into an emergency staging area by the time David arrived with his father. Village residents had gathered emergency supplies and medical equipment, including the basic first aid supplies maintained by the community for fishing injuries and other emergencies. However, the severity of Mike's injuries exceeded anything the village's resources could address. Sarah Sanchez arrived at the harbor as her husband was being lifted from the Maria Elena onto the dock. The sight of Mike's massive injuries and unconscious state was a devastating shock to the woman who had shared 28 years of marriage and raised 2 children with the man now fighting for his life. Sarah's training as a teacher included basic first aid, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of seeing her husband's body ravaged by a bear attack. The first aid measures applied to Mike on the dock focused on controlling bleeding and maintaining his airway while waiting for the Coast Guard helicopter that had been dispatched from Kodiak City. Villagers used towels, clothing, and whatever materials were available to apply pressure to the most severe lacerations, but the extent of the injuries made comprehensive treatment impossible with the resources available. Mike's vital signs, monitored by Tom Alexakov using equipment from the Harbormaster's emergency kit, showed the rapid deterioration typical of massive blood loss. His pulse was weak and rapid, his blood pressure was dropping steadily, and his breathing was becoming increasingly shallow. The combination of injuries made it clear that Mike needed immediate surgical intervention to have any chance of survival. The Coast Guard HH-60 Jayhawk helicopter dispatched from Air Station Kodiak arrived over Larsen Bay at 10:15 p.m., approximately 35 minutes after the attack ended. The aircraft's crew included a flight paramedic trained in trauma medicine, but the helicopter's medical equipment was designed for stabilizing patients during transport rather than performing the surgical procedures that Mike's injuries required. The helicopter's landing at the small airstrip adjacent to Larsen Bay was complicated by crosswinds and the uneven terrain that characterized the community's aviation facilities. The airstrip, a gravel runway originally constructed to support the cannery's operations, was barely adequate for the Coast Guard helicopter and required precise flying to execute a safe landing in the deteriorating weather conditions. Flight paramedic Jennifer Walsh's initial assessment of Mike's condition confirmed the fears of everyone who had witnessed the attack. Mike had sustained massive blood loss from multiple lacerations, probable internal bleeding from blunt force trauma, and severe hypothermia from his extended exposure to cold water. His condition was critical, and his chances of surviving the flight to Anchorage were marginal at best. The process of stabilizing Mike for transport required the flight paramedic to establish IV access for fluid replacement, intubate him to maintain his airway, and apply pressure dressings to the most severe external wounds. However, the extent of his injuries meant that these measures were essentially buying time rather than addressing the fundamental problems that threatened his life. Mike's transport from the dock to the helicopter required a coordinated effort by village residents who served as stretcher bearers across the uneven terrain between the harbor and the airstrip. The procession through the village, illuminated by flashlights and vehicle headlights, created a somber parade that underscored the gravity of the situation. Sarah Sanchez's decision to accompany her husband to Anchorage meant leaving David to deal with the aftermath of the attack while she focused on Mike's medical needs. The family's separation during this critical time added emotional stress to an already overwhelming situation, but the helicopter's weight limitations made it impossible for both family members to accompany Mike. The Coast Guard helicopter's departure from Larsen Bay at 10:45 p.m. marked the beginning of Mike's journey toward definitive medical care, but also the start of a race against time that seemed increasingly likely to end in tragedy. The flight to Anchorage would take approximately 90 minutes, during which Mike's condition would continue to deteriorate despite the flight paramedic's best efforts. Flight paramedic Walsh's radio report to Providence, Alaska Medical Center provided the hospital's trauma team with their first detailed assessment of Mike's injuries. The report included estimated blood loss of approximately 40% of total blood volume, multiple penetrating wounds requiring surgical repair, and severe hypothermia requiring aggressive rewarming protocols. Dr. James Morrison, The trauma surgeon on call at Providence, Alaska Medical Center began assembling the medical team that would receive Mike upon his arrival. The team included anesthesiologist Dr. Sarah Kim, operating room nurses Jennifer Lopez and Maria Gonzalez, and surgical technician Robert Thompson. Additional blood products were cross-matched and prepared for immediate transfusion. The helicopter's flight path across the Gulf of Alaska took it over some of the most remote and unforgiving terrain in North America. The route passed over mountains, glaciers, and vast expanses of water where an emergency landing would have been impossible. Flight paramedic Walsh monitored Mike's vital signs continuously during the flight, adjusting medications and fluids in response to his changing condition. Mike's blood pressure continued to drop during the flight, despite aggressive fluid resuscitation, indicating ongoing internal bleeding that could only be addressed through surgical intervention. His core body temperature, measured at 85 degrees Fahrenheit when he was loaded onto the helicopter, was rising slowly in response to warming blankets and heated IV fluids. The psychological impact of the attack on the community of Larsen Bay began to manifest even as the medical emergency continued to unfold. Residents who had witnessed the attack or its aftermath struggled to process the reality of what they had seen, while parents began implementing additional precautions to protect their children from similar encounters. Tom Alexakov's report to the Alaska Department of Fish and Game triggered the agency's protocols for investigating bear attacks and assessing the ongoing threat to public safety. Wildlife Protection Trooper Mark Stevens was dispatched from Kodiak City to investigate the incident and determine the appropriate response to Bear 447's continued presence in the area. The Wounded Bears Trail was located by Trooper Stevens using tracking dogs brought from Kodiak City on a charter flight that arrived in Larsen Bay at 11:30 p.m. The blood trail and paw prints in the soft ground near the harbor confirmed that Bear 447 had been seriously wounded by Tom Alexakov's rifle shot, but had not been killed. The decision to pursue and destroy the wounded bear was made based on established protocols that classified any bear involved in a serious attack on humans as an immediate threat to public safety. The bear's previous history of problematic behavior and his demonstrated willingness to attack humans made his continued presence in the area unacceptable to wildlife authorities. The tracking operation continued through the night as Trooper Stevens and 2 local volunteers followed Bear 447's trail into the dense forest that surrounded Larsen Bay. The wounded animal's movement pattern showed signs of disorientation and fatigue, suggesting that Tom Alexakov's rifle shot had caused significant damage. Bear 447 was located at 2:15 a.m. on June 22nd, approximately 3 miles from the scene of the attack, lying beneath a large spruce tree where he had apparently sought shelter. The animal was still alive, but clearly dying from the gunshot wound, which had shattered his left shoulder and caused massive internal bleeding. Trooper Stevens administered a final shot that ended Bear 447's life immediately. The helicopter carrying Mike Sanchez arrived at Providence, Alaska Medical Center at 12:20 a.m. on June 22nd, where the trauma team was waiting in the emergency department with operating room preparations already underway. Mike's transfer from the helicopter to the hospital's trauma bay took less than 2 minutes, but his condition had continued to deteriorate during the flight. Dr. Morrison's initial examination confirmed the severity of Mike's injuries and the urgency of surgical intervention. The bear's claws had created lacerations that required repair by multiple surgical teams working simultaneously, while internal bleeding from blunt force trauma necessitated immediate exploratory surgery to identify and control the sources of hemorrhage. Mike was taken directly to Operating Room 3, where Dr. Morrison and his team began the complex process of repairing the damage inflicted by Bear 447's attack. The surgery would require more than 8 hours and involve specialists from multiple medical disciplines working to save Mike's life. The operating room was prepared for massive transfusion protocols that would replace most of Mike's blood volume with donor products during the course of the surgery. The hospital's blood bank had been alerted to prepare additional units of type O negative blood, which could be safely administered to any patient regardless of blood type. Sarah Sanchez's vigil in the hospital's surgical waiting area began what would become a weeks-long stay in Anchorage while her husband fought for his life. The hospital's social worker, Linda Chen, provided support and assisted with the practical arrangements necessary for Sarah's extended stay far from home. Dr. Morrison's initial surgical exploration revealed the full extent of Mike's internal injuries. The bear's powerful blows had caused liver lacerations, kidney damage, and internal bleeding from multiple sources that required immediate repair. The surgical team worked methodically to identify and control each source of bleeding while maintaining Mike's blood pressure through continuous transfusion. The repair of Mike's external wounds required plastic surgeon Dr. Amanda Rodriguez to join the surgical team. The bear's claws had created complex lacerations that would require multiple stages of reconstruction to restore function and minimize scarring. The initial surgery focused on cleaning the wounds and creating primary closures that would allow healing to begin. Mike's hypothermia required specialized rewarming protocols that were implemented while the surgical repairs continued. The operating room's temperature was raised to accommodate the warming blankets and heated irrigation solutions used to gradually restore Mike's core body temperature to normal levels. The surgery's progress was communicated to Sarah through regular updates from Dr. Morrison and the hospital's nursing staff. Each report provided both hope and concern. The surgical team was successfully controlling the bleeding and repairing the most critical injuries, but Mike's overall condition remained extremely unstable. David Sanchez's flight from Kodiak City to Anchorage arrived at 6:30 a.m. on June 22nd, allowing him to join his mother in the surgical waiting area while the operation continued. The young fisherman had spent the night dealing with the immediate aftermath of the attack, including securing his father's boat and catch while struggling to process the trauma of witnessing the attack. The completion of Mike's initial surgery at 8:45 a.m. marked the end of the most critical phase of his medical treatment, but the beginning of a long and uncertain recovery process. Dr. Morrison's report to the family was cautiously optimistic. The surgical team had successfully controlled the bleeding and repaired the most life-threatening injuries, but Mike remained in critical condition with multiple complications possible. Mike's transfer to the intensive care unit began the next phase of his treatment, focusing on supporting his organ systems while his body attempted to recover from the massive trauma. The ICU team, led by Dr. Patricia Williams, implemented protocols for monitoring and treating the complications that commonly followed such severe injuries. The media coverage of Mike's attack began with initial reports on Alaska news stations during the morning broadcasts on June 22nd. The story of a fisherman attacked by a brown bear while cleaning fish captured public attention and quickly spread to national news outlets seeking dramatic stories from America's last frontier. Reporter Jennifer Thompson from KTUU Channel 2 in Anchorage arrived in Larsen Bay on June 22nd to cover the story for the evening news. Her interviews with community members who had witnessed the attack or participated in the rescue efforts provided the first detailed public account of the incident. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game's official statement about the attack was released on June 22nd, confirming that Bear 447 had been destroyed and that an investigation into the incident was ongoing. The statement emphasized the rarity of such attacks and reminded the public about proper precautions for avoiding dangerous encounters with bears. Mike's condition during his first day in the ICU showed the expected complications of massive trauma and blood loss. His kidneys, damaged both by the bear's attack and by the shock that followed, required continuous monitoring for signs of failure. His liver, lacerated by the bear's claws, was assessed for ongoing bleeding and functional impairment. The psychological impact of the attack on Mike's family became apparent as Sarah and David struggled to cope with the sudden transformation of their lives. The fishing season that should have provided the family's primary income was now secondary to Mike's survival, creating financial pressures that compounded their emotional stress. Dr. Williams's assessment of Mike's neurological status revealed signs of brain injury that were likely caused by prolonged periods underwater during the attack. The combination of oxygen deprivation and blood loss had affected his cognitive function, making his long-term prognosis uncertain even if he survived his physical injuries. The community of Larsen Bay began implementing enhanced bear safety protocols in response to the attack, including increased patrols around the harbor area and mandatory escorts for fishermen working alone at cleaning stations. The attack had reminded everyone of the constant presence of danger in Alaska's wilderness areas. Sarah Sanchez's first conversation with her unconscious husband occurred on the evening of June 22nd, as Mike's sedation was lightened to assess his neurological response. Although Mike could not respond, Sarah spoke to him about family news and fishing updates, maintaining the connection that had sustained their marriage through 28 years. The hospital's chaplain, Father Michael O'Brien, provided spiritual support to the Sanchez family as they grappled with questions about why the attack had occurred and what it meant for their future. The randomness of the encounter and its devastating consequences challenged their faith and their understanding of their place in Alaska's natural world. Mike's first sign of neurological improvement came on June 24th, when he briefly opened his eyes in response to Sarah's voice. Although he could not speak due to his breathing tube, his recognition of his wife's presence provided hope that his brain function was recovering from the trauma. Dr. Morrison's assessment of Mike's surgical wounds showed good healing without signs of infection, a positive development that reduced the risk of complications that could threaten his recovery. The bear's claws had introduced bacteria into the wounds, but aggressive antibiotic treatment had prevented the development of serious infections. The physical therapy evaluation conducted on June 25th revealed the extent of the functional impairments that Mike would face during his recovery. The damage to muscles in his back and shoulders had significantly limited his range of motion, while nerve damage in his arms affected his fine motor control. David Sanchez's return to Larsen Bay on June 26 allowed him to resume fishing operations and maintain the family's income during Mike's hospitalization. The young fisherman's ability to operate both boats by himself was limited, but other community members volunteered to help with the more demanding aspects of commercial fishing. The insurance investigation into Mike's attack began on June 27th as representatives from his health insurance company and workers' compensation carrier attempted to determine coverage for his medical expenses and lost income. The unusual circumstances of the attack created complications in determining which policies would provide coverage. Mike's removal from the ventilator on June 28th marked a significant milestone in his recovery, allowing him to breathe independently for the first time since the attack. Although his breathing was labored and his voice was weak, his ability to communicate with his family provided emotional relief after days of uncertainty. The first detailed interview with Mike about his memories of the attack occurred on June 30th, as Dr. Williams assessed his cognitive function and tried to understand the psychological impact of the traumatic experience. Mike's recollections were fragmented and confused, but he clearly remembered the terror of being pursued through the water by the massive bear. The Alaska State Troopers' final report on the incident was completed on July 2nd, concluding that the attack was unprovoked and that no criminal charges would be filed. The report emphasized that Mike had followed appropriate safety protocols and that the attack was an unavoidable consequence of living and working in bear habitat. Mike's first attempt at physical therapy on July 5th revealed the extent of his physical limitations following the attack. The damage to his back and shoulder muscles made it impossible for him to perform the lifting and reaching motions that were essential to commercial fishing, raising questions about his ability to return to his livelihood. The financial impact of Mike's extended hospitalization became apparent as bills began arriving from the various medical specialists involved in his care. Despite having health insurance, the family faced substantial out-of-pocket expenses that threatened their ability to maintain their home and fishing operation. The community fundraiser organized by Larsen Bay residents on July 10th raised $15,000 to help offset the Sanchez family's medical expenses and lost income. The event demonstrated the close-knit nature of the fishing community and the mutual support that helped families survive crises that could otherwise be financially devastating. Mike's discharge from the hospital on July 15th, 24 days after the attack, marked the beginning of his long-term recovery process. Although his major injuries had healed sufficiently to allow him to return home, he faced months of additional physical therapy and an uncertain prognosis for returning to commercial fishing. The homecoming to Larsen Bay was both joyful and sobering for the Sanchez family. Mike's obvious physical limitations and continuing psychological trauma from the attack had fundamentally changed the family's expectations for the future, requiring adjustments to their lifestyle and financial planning. Dr. Patricia Chen, the psychologist assigned to help Mike cope with the psychological aftermath of the attack, diagnosed him with post-traumatic stress disorder characterized by nightmares, anxiety attacks, and an irrational fear of water. The diagnosis added another dimension to his recovery process and raised questions about his ability to return to a livelihood that depended on working around water. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game's analysis of the attack identified several factors that had contributed to the dangerous encounter. Bear 447's previous history of problematic behavior, the isolated location of the fish cleaning activity, and the presence of fish attractants had combined to create conditions that maximize the risk of a serious attack. The agency's recommendations for preventing similar incidents included mandatory bear safety training for commercial fishermen, improved lighting and communication equipment at remote fishing sites, and enhanced reporting systems for tracking problem bears before they escalated to dangerous behavior. Mike's first attempt to return to the harbor where the attack occurred happened on August 1st, 6 weeks after the incident. Although he was accompanied by David and several other fishermen, Mike experienced a severe anxiety attack that forced him to leave the area without completing his intended inspection of the Santos. The boat had remained tied to the cannery dock since the night of the attack, serving as a stark reminder of the trauma that had changed Mike's life. Community members had maintained the vessel and preserved Mike's fishing gear, hoping that he would eventually be able to return to commercial fishing. The psychological evaluation conducted on August 15th revealed that Mike's post-traumatic stress disorder was severe enough to prevent him from working alone on the water, effectively ending his career as an independent commercial fisherman. The diagnosis was devastating for a man whose identity had been shaped by 40 years of fishing Alaska's waters. Sarah Sanchez's decision to take early retirement from her teaching position was driven by the need to provide full-time care for her husband as he continued his recovery. The family's reduced income required significant lifestyle changes and raised concerns about their long-term financial security. The civil lawsuit filed against the Alaska Department of Fish and Game on September 1st alleged that the agency had failed to adequately monitor and control Bear 447 despite his known history of problematic behavior. The lawsuit sought compensation for Mike's medical expenses, lost income, and pain and suffering. The legal proceedings were complicated by Alaska's statutes regarding liability for wildlife encounters, which generally protected government agencies from lawsuits related to attacks by wild animals. The plaintiff's attorneys argued that Bear 447's documented history created a special duty of care that the state had failed to fulfill. Mike's participation in a support group for trauma survivors began in September, providing him with contact with others who had experienced life-changing injuries and psychological trauma. The group's weekly meetings became an important part of his recovery process and helped him develop coping strategies for his ongoing challenges. The salmon season that Mike missed due to his injuries proved to be one of the most productive in recent years, creating additional financial stress for the family as they watched other fishermen enjoy record catches while dealing with mounting medical bills and lost income. David Sanchez's decision to continue operating the family's fishing business provided some income, but was insufficient to replace Mike's experienced participation in the operation. The young fisherman's learning curve was steep, and several costly mistakes during the season highlighted the value of Mike's decades of experience. The insurance settlement reached in October provided partial compensation for Mike's medical expenses, but fell far short of replacing the income he would have earned during a full fishing career. The settlement required the family to abandon any future claims related to the attack in exchange for immediate financial relief. Mike's physical condition 6 months after the attack showed significant improvement in his major injuries, but persistent limitations that would prevent him from returning to commercial fishing. The nerve damage in his arms had partially healed, but his reduced strength and range of motion made the physical demands of fishing impossible. The psychological counseling that continued through the fall gradually helped Mike develop coping mechanisms for his post-traumatic stress disorder. But the fundamental fear of water and bears remained largely unchanged. His therapist, Dr. Chen, described his progress as typical for severe trauma cases, but emphasized that full recovery might take years. The community's response to the attack included enhanced bear awareness programs and improved safety protocols for commercial fishing operations. The Larsen Bay Harbor Commission implemented new regulations requiring communication equipment and emergency supplies for all boats operating from the harbor. The anniversary of the attack on June 21, 2026, found Mike Sanchez significantly recovered from his physical injuries, but still struggling with the psychological aftermath of his encounter with Bear 447. His story had become part of the folklore of Larsen Bay, a reminder of the constant presence of danger in Alaska's wilderness and the fragility of human life in the face of nature's power. The Santos, refitted and returned to service under David's command, continued to fish the waters around Kodiak Island, but Mike never again set foot on the vessel that had been his livelihood for more than 2 decades. The dock where the attack occurred was eventually demolished and replaced with a new structure equipped with emergency communication systems and enhanced lighting. Bear 447's story ended with his death in the forest outside Larsen Bay, but his legacy continued in the enhanced safety protocols and increased awareness that followed his attack on Mike Sanchez. The incident served as a stark reminder that humans living and working in bear country must maintain constant vigilance and respect for the apex predators that share Alaska's wilderness. The broader implications of Mike's attack extended beyond the immediate community to influence bear management policies throughout Alaska. The case became a textbook example of how individual problem bears could escalate from nuisance behavior to deadly attacks, and how early intervention might prevent such tragedies. Mike's current life, more than a year after the attack, reflects the profound changes that a single moment of violence can inflict on a family's future. He has found meaningful work as a harbor safety instructor, teaching younger fishermen about the hazards they face and the precautions that might save their lives. Sarah Sanchez returned to teaching on a part-time basis once Mike's condition stabilized, but the family's financial situation never fully recovered from the impact of the attack. The medical bills, lost income, and ongoing therapy costs created a burden that would affect their retirement planning for years to come. David Sanchez's evolution from a young fisherman learning the trade to the head of the family's fishing operation was accelerated by necessity following his father's attack. His success in maintaining the business, despite the challenges, demonstrated the resilience that characterized Alaska's fishing families. The Sanchez family's story became part of a larger narrative about the costs and benefits of living in Alaska's wilderness areas. Their experience illustrated both the beauty and danger of a lifestyle that remained connected to the natural world while depending on its resources for survival. The memory of June 21st, 2025, remained vivid in the minds of everyone who witnessed or participated in the rescue efforts that followed Mike's attack. The incident had tested the community's emergency response capabilities and revealed both strengths and weaknesses in their ability to handle life-threatening situations. The lessons learned from Mike's encounter with Bear 447 continued to influence bear safety education and management practices throughout Alaska. His story served as a powerful reminder that even experienced outdoorsmen could find themselves in situations where survival depended on factors beyond their control. The dock where Mike Sanchez cleaned his final catch before being attacked by Bear 447 no longer exists, having been replaced by a modern facility with enhanced safety features. However, the waters of Larsen Bay remain unchanged, continuing to provide the salmon that sustain the community while harboring the same dangers that nearly claimed Mike's life. The legacy of that June evening in 2025 extends far beyond the immediate participants to encompass anyone who works or recreates in Alaska's bear country. Mike's survival, despite the severity of his injuries, demonstrated both human resilience and the importance of rapid emergency response in remote areas. The bear that attacked Mike Sanchez was destroyed, but hundreds of others continued to roam Kodiak Island's forests and shorelines, following the same ancient patterns that brought Bear 447 to the cannery dock on that fateful night. The challenge for Alaska's residents remains the same: learning to coexist with apex predators while pursuing livelihoods that depend on shared natural resources. Mike Sanchez's story continues to evolve as he adapts to life after trauma, but June 21st, 2025 will always mark the night when a routine fishing day became a fight for survival that changed everything he thought he knew about living in Alaska's wilderness. The scars on his body serve as permanent reminders of his encounter with Bear 447, but they also represent his survival of an ordeal that many would not have lived to tell. The next stories. Kodiak Bear mauls fisherman on dock, June 21st, 2025. Kodiak Bear mauls fisherman on dock, June 21st, 2025. The morning sun cast long shadows across Larsen Bay as Michael Antonio Sanchez adjusted his worn baseball cap against the growing light. At 54, his weathered hands moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent 3 decades working Alaska's treacherous waters. The Kodiak Island fishing village of 400 souls was stirring to life around him, but Mike preferred these quiet, pre-dawn hours when the world belonged to fishermen and the creatures that prowled the surrounding wilderness. Mike had arrived in Larsen Bay 17 years ago, following the collapse of his marriage in Tacoma and a string of failed business ventures that had left him emotionally and financially bankrupt. Sarah Sanchez had taken their two children, Elena and Marcus, and moved back to her mother's house in Portland, leaving Mike with nothing but a rusted pickup truck and the crushing weight of his failures. Alaska had seemed like salvation then, a place where a man could disappear into honest work and perhaps find some measure of peace among the wild spaces that still existed at the edge of civilization. He had spent his first winter in Kodiak, working odd jobs for Peterson's cannery, sleeping in a rented room above Molly's Tavern and learning the rhythms of a community that operated according to the whims of weather, tides, and the migration patterns of salmon. By spring, he had saved enough to buy a partnership stake in the fishing vessel Northern Grace, owned by Captain Robert Bear Thompson, a 67-year-old former crab fisherman whose reputation for finding fish was matched only by his legendary consumption of bourbon and his encyclopedic knowledge of every dangerous reef, current, and weather pattern within a 100-mile radius of Kodiak Island. The Northern Grace was a 38-foot fiberglass boat that had seen better decades. Her hull bore the scars of countless encounters with floating debris, rocky shorelines, and the occasional collision with ice floes that drifted down from the Arctic during particularly harsh winters. But she was seaworthy and reliable, and more importantly, she was Mike's ticket to a life that made sense again. Out on the water, with the endless expanse of the Pacific stretching to the horizon and the primal satisfaction of hauling in nets heavy with silver salmon, he could forget about the suburban house he had lost to foreclosure, the small accounting firm that had failed when his drinking got out of control, and the look of quiet disappointment in Sarah's eyes the last time he had seen her. Captain Thompson had become something between a father figure and a business partner to Mike over the years. The older man had recognized something in the broken refugee from the lower 48, perhaps seeing echoes of his own younger self in Mike's determination to remake his life through hard work and solitude. Thompson had taught Mike everything about reading weather patterns, understanding fish behavior, navigating by stars when the GPS failed, and most importantly, respecting the power and unpredictability of the Alaskan wilderness. "The moment you start thinking you've got this place figured out," Thompson would say during their long hours working the nets, "that's when Alaska will remind you who's really in charge. The ocean, the weather, the animals, they don't care about your plans or your schedule. You learn to work with them, or you die." Those words echoed in Mike's mind as he secured the last of his gear on the dock at 5:47 a.m. on June 21st, 2025. The longest day of the year had arrived with unusual warmth for this latitude, the temperature already climbing toward what the Weather Service predicted would be a record-breaking 73 degrees. Climate change had brought increasingly unpredictable weather patterns to Alaska, and Mike had noticed changes in fish behavior, ocean temperatures, and even the migration routes of marine mammals over his years on the water. The Northern Grace sat low in the water, her hold packed with the previous day's catch, nearly 800 pounds of coho salmon that they had pulled from the rich waters near Ugak Bay. It had been one of their best runs of the season, and Mike felt the quiet satisfaction that came with honest work well done. The salmon were beautiful fish, their silver sides gleaming in the early morning light, their flesh firm and bright orange-pink with the accumulated nutrients from their ocean feeding. These fish would be processed at Peterson's cannery, canned or flash frozen, and shipped to markets across the United States and Asia, feeding families thousands of miles away, while providing Mike with enough income to maintain his simple life in this remote corner of the world. But first, he needed to clean and sort his share of the catch. Mike's agreement with Captain Thompson allocated 30% of their take to him, with the remainder going to Thompson and their third partner, Jimmy Kowalski, a 28-year-old from Michigan who had arrived in Kodiak 2 years earlier with a degree in marine biology and romantic notions about living off the land. Jimmy was a good worker despite his youth and inexperience, and he brought a scientific perspective to their operation that had helped them identify new fishing areas and understand the impact of changing ocean conditions on salmon populations. Mike began the methodical process of cleaning his fish, using a technique he had perfected over years of practice. His knife was a custom-made fillet blade forged by a blacksmith in Anchorage, its steel sharp enough to slice through salmon skin with minimal pressure while maintaining the precision necessary to separate flesh from bone without waste. He worked quickly but carefully, aware that the warming temperature would accelerate spoilage if he lingered too long over the process. The dock stretched 50 feet into Larsen Bay, supported by massive pressure-treated pilings that had been driven deep into the seafloor during the facility's construction in 1987. The structure was built to withstand the extreme tidal variations common to this part of Alaska, where spring tides could create a vertical difference of nearly 20 feet between high and low water. At this hour, the tide was approximately 3 hours into its ebb cycle, leaving about 12 feet of water beneath the dock's end where Mike worked. The exposed portions of the pilings showed a clear line marking the previous high tide, decorated with strands of kelp and the occasional starfish that had been stranded by the receding water. Dr. Jennifer Reese, a wildlife biologist with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, would later testify that the unusually warm weather on June 21st had created optimal conditions for increased bear activity. Kodiak brown bears, the largest subspecies of brown bear in North America, were emerging from their winter dens later than usual due to extended snow cover in the island's mountainous interior, creating a compressed feeding season that intensified competition for food sources. Adult male Kodiak bears could weigh up to 1,500 pounds and stand over 10 feet tall on their hind legs, making them apex predators capable of overpowering any other creature they might encounter. The bear that would change Mike Sanchez's life forever was a 9-year-old male designated by researchers as Bear K247. Weighing approximately 1,100 pounds and measuring 8 feet 4 inches from nose to tail, he was a magnificent specimen of Ursus arctos middendorfi, the scientific name for the Kodiak brown bear subspecies. His thick coat ranged from dark chocolate brown on his back and shoulders to lighter cinnamon tones on his flanks and belly, and his massive head bore the distinctive dished face profile and pronounced shoulder hump that distinguished brown bears from their black bear cousins. Bear greater than K247 had been radio-collared and monitored by researchers since 2019 as part of a long-term study examining the impact of climate change on Kodiak bear populations. His tracking data showed a territorial range covering nearly 200 square miles of the island's southwestern quadrant, including the watersheds that fed into Larsen Bay. Unlike many of his species, K247 had shown unusual tolerance for human presence, often foraging within a mile of the village without displaying aggressive behavior. This habituation to humans, while making him valuable for research purposes, had also made him increasingly bold in his exploration of human-occupied areas. The bear's movement data from the week preceding June 21st showed a concerning pattern. He had been following salmon runs upstream from Larsen Bay, but recent drought conditions had reduced water levels in several key spawning streams, forcing the fish to concentrate in areas where they were easier for bears to catch, but also closer to human activity. On June 18th, trail cameras had captured images of K247 feeding on salmon carcasses less than 2 miles from the village, and his radio collar indicated he had spent the night of June 20th in a dense thicket of alder and willow, approximately 1 mile northeast of the harbor. Dr. Margaret Chen, a bear behavior specialist at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, had been analyzing K247's behavior patterns as part of her doctoral research on human-bear interactions in coastal Alaska. Her preliminary findings suggested that the bear's increasing proximity to human habitation correlated with changes in natural food availability caused by warming ocean temperatures and altered precipitation patterns. Salmon runs were arriving later and lasting for shorter periods, forcing bears to modify their traditional feeding behaviors and explore new foraging opportunities. Mike remained unaware of the scientific drama unfolding around him as he worked through his catch. His attention was focused on the rhythmic motions of his knife and the satisfying precision of transforming whole fish into neat fillets that would be vacuum-packed and frozen for later consumption. He had developed a system over the years that minimized waste while maximizing the quality of his preserved fish, and he took professional pride in the consistency of his results. The morning air was filled with the sounds and smells of a working waterfront. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their harsh cries mixing with the distant rumble of diesel engines as other boats prepared for the day's fishing. The aroma of saltwater, fish, and creosote from the dock pilings created the distinctive perfume of maritime commerce that Mike had grown to love. Occasionally he could hear voices from the village as early risers emerged to tend to their own boats or walk their dogs along the shoreline. At 6:23 a.m., Mike paused in his work to take a drink from the thermos of coffee he had prepared before leaving his small apartment. The coffee was black and strong, brewed from beans he had ordered online from a roaster in Seattle, one of his few remaining connections to the world beyond Alaska. As he unscrewed the thermos cap, he noticed movement in the tree line approximately 300 yards inland from the harbor. A flash of brown among the green foliage caught his attention, but it disappeared quickly enough that he dismissed it as possibly a deer or one of the island's small population of Sitka black-tailed deer. What Mike had actually seen was Bear K247 conducting his own surveillance of the harbor area. The bear's acute sense of smell, capable of detecting odors from several miles away, had locked onto the concentrated scent of fresh salmon emanating from the docks. Unlike the scattered and often spoiled fish carcasses he had been finding in the depleted streams, this represented a concentrated food source that could provide the thousands of calories he needed to maintain his massive body weight during the brief Alaskan summer. The bear moved with surprising stealth for such a large animal, utilizing natural cover and his instinctive understanding of wind patterns to remain undetected as he approached the harbor. Brown bears were capable of running at speeds exceeding 30 miles per hour despite their bulk, and their intelligence rivaled that of primates in many cognitive tests. K247 had learned through experience that humans often abandoned food sources when confronted by his presence, and his behavioral history suggested he viewed intimidation rather than direct predation as his primary strategy for acquiring human-associated food resources. However, several factors made June 21st different from the bear's previous encounters with humans. The extended winter had depleted his fat reserves more than usual, creating a metabolic urgency that increased his willingness to take risks for high-quality food sources. Additionally, the early morning hour meant that Mike was working alone on the isolated dock, without the safety net of multiple humans whose presence might have deterred the bear's approach. Most critically, the wind direction was carrying Mike's scent inland rather than bringing the bear's scent to him, preventing the early warning that might have allowed him to retreat to safety. Captain Robert Thompson was preparing for departure from his slip approximately 100 yards away from Mike's position, but the diesel engine noise from his boat's warming motor masked the subtle sounds that might have indicated the bear's approach. Thompson had been fishing these waters for over 4 decades and possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense changes in the environment that could signal danger. But on this morning, his attention was focused on a problem with his boat's hydraulic system that was preventing proper operation of his net winch. Jimmy Kowalski was still at his apartment, planning to meet Mike and Thompson at the dock by 7 a.m. for their scheduled departure. Jimmy had spent the previous evening at Molly's Tavern celebrating their successful fishing run with several other crew members from the local fleet, and he was struggling with a hangover that made the prospect of another day on the water less appealing than usual. His delay in arriving at the dock would later be identified as one of several small factors that contributed to the tragic isolation of Mike's final moments. The village of Larsen Bay itself was largely deserted at this early hour. Most of the population consisted of commercial fishermen, cannery workers, and support personnel whose schedules revolved around tides, weather, and the seasonal rhythms of the salmon industry. The nearest occupied building to the harbour was the harbour master's office, but harbour master Eugene Gus Patterson wouldn't arrive for his shift until 8 a.m. The absence of early morning foot traffic meant that Mike's position on the dock was effectively isolated, despite being within shouting distance of the village proper. At 6:31 a.m., Bear K247 emerged from the tree line and began his approach across the open ground between the forest and the harbour. His movement was deliberate and confident, suggesting that his previous observations had convinced him that the dock area represented a low-risk, high-reward foraging opportunity. The bear's route took him behind several storage buildings and a stack of crab pots, using these obstacles to mask his approach until he was within 50 yards of the dock. Mike's first awareness of danger came not from visual contact with the bear, but from a change in the behavior of the seagulls that had been circling overhead, hoping for fish scraps. The birds suddenly dispersed with sharp alarm calls, their flight pattern indicating the presence of a large predator in the immediate area. Mike looked up from his work, scanning the sky and then the surrounding area for whatever had spooked the gulls. When he finally spotted the bear, K247 was already at the base of the dock, having covered the final 50 yards of open ground in a matter of seconds. Mike's first coherent thought was disbelief. In 17 years of living and working in Larsen Bay, he had encountered bears on numerous occasions, but always in the wilderness areas away from the village proper. The sight of an adult brown bear standing on the dock where he had worked safely for thousands of hours created a cognitive dissonance that delayed his recognition of the immediate danger. The bear stood approximately 30 feet away, rising onto his hind legs to get a better view of Mike and the source of the salmon scent that had drawn him to this location. At his full height, K247 presented a terrifying spectacle that would have impressed even experienced wildlife professionals. His massive head swayed slightly as he processed the sensory information from this new environment. His small, dark eyes fixed on Mike with an intelligence that was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. For several seconds, man and bear regarded each other across the wooden planks of the dock. Mike's mind raced through his limited options, drawing on years of bear safety training that all Alaskan residents received as a matter of survival. The conventional wisdom called for avoiding direct eye contact, speaking in calm tones, and backing away slowly while making oneself appear as large and unthreatening as possible. Running was specifically discouraged, as it could trigger the bear's predatory instincts and initiate a chase that no human could win. Mike slowly straightened from his crouched position over the fish cleaning station, his movements careful and deliberate. His voice, when he finally found it, came out as a hoarse whisper that barely carried across the distance between them. "Easy, boy," he said, fighting to keep his tone calm and conversational. "Just take it easy. There's plenty of fish here for both of us." The bear dropped back to all fours, but remained motionless, his massive head tilted slightly as he processed Mike's words. Brown bears possessed excellent hearing and could distinguish between different human vocal patterns, often responding differently to calm speech versus shouting or signs of panic. For a moment, Mike felt a flicker of hope that this encounter might end with the bear simply investigating the fish scraps and then departing peacefully. That hope was shattered when K247 took his first step forward along the dock, The sound of 1,100 pounds moving across wooden planks was surprisingly subtle, more of a heavy settling noise than the dramatic thundering that might be expected. But the psychological impact on Mike was immediate and overwhelming. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to dive into the water, to do anything that might create distance between himself and the approaching predator. Only his conscious understanding that sudden movement would likely trigger an attack kept him frozen in place, his body trembling with the effort of suppressing his flight response. The bear moved with the rolling gait characteristic of his species, his massive shoulders creating a hypnotic rhythm as he closed the distance between them. Mike could now see details that would be burned into his memory forever. The individual hairs of the bear's thick coat, the pink interior of his mouth when he briefly opened his jaws to test the air, the surprising delicacy of his movements despite his overwhelming size. At 20 feet, the bear paused again, this time focusing his attention on the fish cleaning station where Mike had been working. The concentration of salmon scent was strongest here, and K247's behavior suggested he was calculating the best approach to claim this valuable food source. His experience with humans had taught him that they usually retreated when confronted by his presence, and his body language indicated confidence that this encounter would follow the same pattern. Mike made his critical error at 6:34 a.m., when he decided to attempt a strategic retreat toward the dock's shore end. His plan was to back away slowly while talking to the bear, gradually increasing the distance between them until he could reach the safety of the harbormaster's office or one of the nearby buildings. It was a reasonable strategy based on established bear safety protocols, but it failed to account for the specific behavioral characteristics of a bear that had become habituated to human food sources. As Mike took his first backward step, K247 interpreted the movement as an indication that the human was abandoning the food source. Rather than allowing Mike to retreat peacefully, the bear's conditioning kicked in, and he moved quickly forward to claim what he now viewed as his rightful prize. The sudden acceleration from a careful stalk to rapid approach triggered Mike's panic response, and he abandoned his careful retreat in favor of a desperate run toward shore. The race was over before it truly began. While humans can achieve impressive running speeds over long distances, their acceleration is no match for that of a brown bear motivated by food acquisition. K247 closed the remaining 20 feet between them in less than 2 seconds, moving with a fluid power that demonstrated why brown bears were the apex predators of their ecosystem. Mike felt the bear's presence behind him before the actual contact occurred, a sensation he would later describe to paramedics as feeling like standing too close to a moving freight train. The bear's breath was hot against the back of his neck, carrying the musky scent of his coat and the fish-laden aroma of his recent meals. When the impact came, it arrived with a force that lifted Mike completely off his feet and sent him tumbling across the dock's wooden planks. The initial strike came from the bear's massive paw, which caught Mike across his lower back and right shoulder with enough force to crack 2 ribs and dislocate his shoulder joint. Pain exploded through his nervous system as he hit the dock face first, his nose breaking against the weathered wood with a wet, crunching sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the morning stillness. Blood immediately began flowing from his nasal passages, mixing with the fish scales and seawater that coated the dock's surface. Mike's survival instincts, honed by millions of years of evolution, kicked in as he struggled to regain his footing despite his injuries. The adrenaline flooding his system temporarily masked the worst of his pain, allowing him to roll over and face his attacker. What he saw nearly froze his heart in his chest. Bear greater than K247 stood over him, massive and terrible in the growing daylight. The bear's lips were pulled back in what might have been a snarl, or simply his natural expression when investigating something new, revealing teeth that seemed designed for crushing bone and tearing flesh. His dark eyes held an intelligence that was somehow more frightening than simple animal fury. This was not a mad beast acting on pure instinct, but a calculating predator making decisions about how to handle the situation that had developed. For a moment that felt like an eternity, they remained locked in this tableau. Mike, bleeding and broken, sprawled on his back on the wooden dock. The bear, enormous and powerful, standing over him with the absolute confidence of a creature that had no natural enemies. Around them, the normal sounds of the harbor continued. The cries of seagulls, the distant rumble of boat engines, the gentle lapping of waves against the dock pilings, creating a surreal contrast to the life and death drama playing out on the isolated dock. Mike tried to speak, to use his voice as a tool for de-escalation, as he had been taught in bear safety courses. But his broken nose and the blood flowing into his throat made speech nearly impossible, and the sounds that emerged were closer to gasps and gurgles than recognizable words. The bear's ears pricked forward slightly at these sounds, his head tilting as he processed this new information. What happened next would be debated by bear behavior experts for months afterward. Rather than immediately attacking Mike while he was vulnerable, K247 turned his attention to the fish cleaning station, apparently deciding that claiming the available food was more important than dealing with the injured human. This behavior was consistent with his previous encounters with humans, where his primary goal had always been food acquisition rather than territorial aggression or predatory hunting. The bear moved to the cleaning station and began investigating the salmon that Mike had been processing. His massive paws delicately manipulated the fish, and he consumed several fillets with obvious satisfaction. Mike watched this scene with a mixture of relief and horror, grateful that the bear's attention had shifted away from him, but terrified that any movement might refocus the predator's interest on him as a threat to be eliminated. Captain Thompson's boat engine had been steadily warming throughout this encounter, but the diesel's rumbling had masked the sounds of the attack from anyone who might have been in a position to help. The layout of the harbor, with its various buildings and stored equipment, meant that Mike's position on the dock was not visible from most of the village, creating a pocket of isolation that the bear had exploited either by instinct or by learned behavior. Mike lay motionless for nearly 10 minutes, watching the bear methodically consume his cleaned fish, while fighting to control his breathing and assess his injuries. His right shoulder was clearly dislocated, creating a constant burning pain that threatened to overwhelm his consciousness. His ribs ached with each breath, suggesting fractures that could potentially puncture internal organs if he moved too aggressively. Most concerning was the continuing flow of blood from his nose and mouth, which was beginning to pool around his head and create a metallic taste that made him nauseous. The bear finished the available fish and turned his attention back to Mike. But rather than showing aggression, K247 seemed curious about this strange creature that had provided such an excellent meal. He approached slowly, sniffing carefully at Mike's prone form. The bear's nose, capable of detecting scents at concentrations nearly 1,000 times lower than human perception, was gathering detailed information about Mike's physical condition, emotional state, and potential threat level. Mike felt the bear's breath against his face and neck as the massive head moved closer. The sensation was surprisingly warm and humid, carrying the overwhelming scent of fish and something deeper and more primal, the distinctive musk of a large predator that had never known fear. When the bear's nose actually touched his skin, Mike had to fight every instinct to prevent himself from flinching away from the contact. It was during this intimate and terrifying examination that Bear K247 made the decision that would transform this encounter from a dramatic but survivable incident into a genuine tragedy. Something in Mike's scent or appearance triggered a behavioral response that researchers would later struggle to understand. Rather than losing interest in the injured human and moving on to search for additional food sources, the bear's demeanor shifted from curious investigation to something that wildlife experts would classify as predatory behavior. The change was subtle, but unmistakable to Mike, who found himself looking directly into the bear's eyes as the animal's intentions crystallized. The intelligence he had noticed earlier was still present, but it was now focused with laser-like intensity on him as a potential source of conflict or competition. Mike's years in Alaska had given him enough experience with wildlife to recognize the difference between a bear that was simply investigating and one that was preparing to eliminate a perceived threat. Bear greater than K247 reared up on his hind legs again, this time directly over Mike's prone form. At this distance, the bear's size was almost incomprehensible, a wall of muscle and fur that blocked out the sky and created its own shadow on the dock. Mike could see the individual claws on the bear's front paws, each one longer than a human finger and sharper than any knife he had ever used for cleaning fish. The reality of what was about to happen crystallized in his mind with devastating clarity. "Please," Mike whispered, the word barely audible through his damaged airways. "Please, God, no." The bear's response was swift and final. He dropped his full weight onto Mike's chest and abdomen, driving the air from his lungs and crushing his ribcage with a sound like breaking kindling. Mike's vision exploded into stars and darkness as his body struggled to process the catastrophic damage. Multiple ribs snapped simultaneously, their sharp ends tearing into his lungs and creating internal bleeding that would make survival impossible even with immediate medical intervention. But Bear K247 was not finished. Having committed to this course of action, his instincts drove him to ensure that the perceived threat was completely neutralized. His massive jaws closed around Mike's head and neck, his teeth penetrating skin and muscle with terrifying ease. The pressure was enormous, far beyond anything Mike's skull could withstand, and consciousness mercifully fled as his body shut down its non-essential systems in a futile attempt to preserve life. The attack lasted less than 30 seconds from its violent beginning to its inevitable conclusion, but the sound finally carried far enough to attract attention from other parts of the harbor. Captain Thompson, who had been focused on his engine problems, heard what he later described as a sound like a tree falling, followed by something that might have been screaming. He shut down his boat's engine and listened carefully, trying to identify the source of the disturbance. Jimmy Kowalski was approaching the harbor on foot, having finally roused himself from his apartment to join his fishing partners for the day's work. He was still half a mile away when the attack occurred, but he would later testify that he heard unusual sounds carrying across the water, not quite human screams, but something that made him quicken his pace toward the dock area. Bear greater than K247 remained with Mike's body for several minutes after the attack, continuing to investigate this new situation and ensuring that the threat had been completely eliminated. His behavior during this period was methodical and calm, showing no signs of the frenzied aggression that might be expected from a predator in the aftermath of a violent encounter. When he finally moved away from the scene, it was with the same deliberate confidence he had shown throughout the entire encounter. The bear's departure route took him back across the open ground behind the harbor buildings. But rather than returning directly to the forest, he moved along the shoreline toward a series of storage sheds where other fishermen kept their gear. His actions suggested that this first successful acquisition of human-associated food had reinforced his confidence in approaching human facilities, creating a dangerous precedent that would complicate response efforts in the coming hours. Captain Thompson's investigation of the strange sounds led him around the harbor complex toward Mike's usual working location. What he discovered at 6:47 a.m. would haunt him for the rest of his life. Mike's body lay twisted and broken on the dock, surrounded by scattered fish fillets and an enormous amount of blood that was already attracting flies in the warming morning air. The scene was so far outside Thompson's experience that he initially struggled to understand what he was seeing. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, the words carrying clearly across the still water. "Oh, Jesus Christ, what happened here?" Thompson's first instinct was to approach Mike's body to check for signs of life, but his years of experience in dangerous environments made him cautious about entering what was clearly a traumatic scene without understanding what had caused it. The massive blood loss and the obvious severity of Mike's injuries suggested that immediate medical intervention would be futile. But Thompson still felt compelled to try something, anything, that might help his friend and partner. As he moved closer to the body, Thompson began to notice details that told the story of what had occurred. Massive claw marks scored the wooden planks of the dock, each one deep enough to suggest the incredible force that had created them. Tufts of brown fur clung to the splinters around these gouges, and the distinctive musky scent of bear was strong enough to be detected even over the overwhelming smell of blood and fish. Thompson's hand shook as he reached for the emergency radio clipped to his belt. His voice cracked when he keyed the microphone and began transmitting on the harbor's emergency frequency. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Captain Robert Thompson, aboard the Northern Grace, at Larsen Bay Harbor. We have a fatality on the main dock. Appears to be a bear attack. Victim is Michael Sanchez. He's gone. We need immediate assistance from state troopers and fish and game. The bear may still be in the area. Over." The response was immediate and professional. The Alaska State Troopers maintained a permanent post in Kodiak, and their dispatcher had been trained to handle wildlife-related emergencies with the efficiency that such situations demanded. Within minutes, a coordinated response was being organized that would involve multiple agencies and dozens of personnel in a complex operation to secure the scene, investigate the attack, and locate the bear responsible. Trooper Sergeant Lisa Martinez was the first responder to reach the scene. Arriving by helicopter at 7:23 a.m., along with Dr. James Patterson, a forensic pathologist from the State Medical Examiner's Office in Anchorage. Martinez had investigated numerous bear attacks during her 12-year career with the Alaska State Troopers, but she was immediately struck by the unusually bold nature of this particular incident. Bear attacks in populated areas were rare, and those that occurred typically involved bears that were defending cubs, protecting food sources, or reacting to surprise encounters with humans. "The location is what makes this so unusual," Martinez explained to Dr. Patterson as they established a perimeter around the crime scene. "Bears don't usually approach dock areas during daylight hours, especially not with this level of confidence. Something drew this animal here, and something made him stay long enough to complete this attack." Dr. Patterson's preliminary examination of Mike's body confirmed the devastating nature of the injuries inflicted by the bear. The trauma was consistent with an attack by a large brown bear, with massive crushing injuries to the chest and abdomen, combined with puncture wounds from teeth and claws that had penetrated deep into vital organs. Time of death was estimated at approximately 6:35 a.m., based on body temperature and the condition of the blood evidence at the scene. "This wasn't a defensive attack," Dr. Patterson noted as he documented the wound patterns. "The positioning and severity of the injuries suggest predatory behavior. The bear made a deliberate decision to kill rather than simply driving the victim away from a food source." Wildlife biologist Dr. Jennifer Reese arrived at the scene at 8:15 a.m., having been flown in from her research station on the eastern side of Kodiak Island. Her examination of the physical evidence confirmed that the attack had been carried out by a large adult male brown bear, and the presence of radio collar fur among the evidence suggested that this was likely one of the research animals being monitored by her department. "We have 23 collared bears currently active on the island," Dr. Reese explained to the investigation team. "Based on the size indicators and the behavioral patterns described by witnesses, This was almost certainly Bear K247, a 9-year-old male that we've been tracking since 2019. His recent movement data shows increasing proximity to human habitation, which has been a concern for our research team. The search for Bear K247 began immediately, utilizing both helicopter reconnaissance and ground teams equipped with tracking equipment and tranquilizer weapons. The bear's radio collar signal was detected at 9:42 a.m., approximately 2 miles southeast of the village, in a dense alder thicket near the mouth of Karluk Creek. His position suggested that he had continued hunting for salmon after leaving the dock area, following the stream inland toward traditional bear feeding areas. Fish and Game Officer Brad Kerner was leading the ground team assigned to locate and assess the bear's behavior. Kerner had 15 years of experience dealing with problem bears throughout Alaska, and his protocol called for attempting to capture and relocate the animal unless its behavior indicated an imminent threat to human safety. However, the deliberate nature of the attack on Mike Sanchez suggested that Bear K247 had crossed a behavioral threshold that made relocation an inadequate response. Once a bear has killed a human in a predatory attack, relocation becomes problematic, Kerner explained to his team as they prepared their approach. The animal has learned that humans represent a viable food source, and that learning doesn't disappear when you move him to a new territory. The risk of repeat incidents becomes unacceptably high. The decision to euthanize Bear K247 was made at 11:15 a.m. by Dr. Reese in consultation with her superiors at the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. The scientific value of the research animal was weighed against the public safety risk he now represented, and the conclusion was unanimous that the bear could not be allowed to remain in the wild. Kerner's team was authorized to use lethal force if the bear could not be safely tranquilized and contained. Bear K247 was located at 12:33 p.m., feeding on salmon carcasses in a shallow pool approximately 50 yards upstream from the creek mouth. His behavior appeared normal for a bear engaged in natural foraging activities, showing no signs of the aggressive conditioning that wildlife officials feared might have developed following his attack on Mike Sanchez. The decision to proceed with euthanasia was difficult for the research team, who had invested years in studying this particular animal's behavior and ecological role. Officer Kerner's shot was clean and instantaneous, ending Bear K247's life without suffering. The massive animal collapsed into the stream where he had been feeding, his blood mixing with the clear water as it flowed toward the sea. A necropsy would later reveal that the bear was in excellent physical condition, with no signs of disease, injury, or starvation that might have explained his unusual behavior toward humans. News of the attack spread rapidly through the small community of Larsen Bay, creating a mixture of shock, grief, and fear that would persist for months. Mike Sanchez had been a respected member of the community, known for his quiet competence and willingness to help neighbors with boat repairs, fishing advice, and the countless small tasks that kept a remote village functioning. His death represented not just a personal tragedy for those who knew him, but a stark reminder of the dangerous realities of life at the edge of the wilderness. Jimmy Kowalski was devastated by the loss of his fishing partner and mentor. He had arrived at the harbor just minutes after the discovery of Mike's body, and the sight of his friend's remains would trigger nightmares and anxiety attacks that would plague him for years. The young marine biologist had been drawn to Alaska by romantic notions of living in harmony with nature, but the brutal reality of Mike's death shattered those illusions and forced him to confront the indifferent violence that was part of the natural world. Mike was the most careful person I knew when it came to bear safety, Jimmy told investigators during his formal interview. He never left food scraps around, always made noise when he was working alone, carried bear spray whenever he went into the bush. The idea that something like this could happen to him in broad daylight at the harbour just doesn't make sense. Captain Thompson struggled with survivor's guilt and the knowledge that he had been less than 100 yards away when his partner was killed. His attempts to understand what he might have done differently consumed his thoughts and interfered with his ability to focus on his work. The Northern Grace remained tied to the dock for 3 weeks following the attack, as Thompson found himself unable to return to the fishing grounds where he and Mike had worked together for so many years. I keep thinking that maybe if I hadn't been so focused on that damn hydraulic problem, maybe if I'd been paying more attention to what was happening around the harbour, I might have heard something earlier, Thompson confided to his sister during a phone call 2 days after the attack. Mike didn't deserve to die alone like that. He was a good man who worked hard and minded his own business. It's not right. The psychological impact of the attack extended beyond those who had known Mike personally. Other commercial fishermen in the harbour began modifying their routines to avoid working alone during early morning or evening hours when bear activity was typically highest. Bear spray sales at the local hardware store increased by more than 400% in the week following the incident, and several fishing crews invested in air horns and other noise-making devices designed to deter wildlife encounters. Dr. Sarah Chen, a trauma counselor flown in from Anchorage to help the community process the tragedy, noted that the random and seemingly unavoidable nature of the attack had created a pervasive sense of vulnerability that was difficult to address through conventional grief counseling. When someone dies in a fishing accident or a plane crash, there's usually some element of human error or equipment failure that can be identified and addressed, Dr. Chen explained to village leaders during a community meeting. This attack feels different because it represents a kind of danger that can't be completely eliminated through preparation or caution. That uncertainty creates a persistent anxiety that can be very difficult to manage. The investigation into the circumstances surrounding the attack revealed several concerning trends that extended beyond the specific incident involving Mike Sanchez and Bear K247. Climate change was altering traditional bear behavior patterns throughout Alaska, forcing the animals to adapt to new environmental conditions and creating increased opportunities for human-wildlife conflict. Warmer temperatures were affecting salmon migration timing, reducing the predictability of natural food sources that bears had relied upon for thousands of years. Dr. Margaret Chen's analysis of radio collar data from the island's bear population showed that multiple animals had been spending increasing amounts of time in proximity to human habitation during the summer of 2025. The combination of late snowmelt, reduced stream flows, and altered fish migration patterns had created a situation where traditional bear feeding areas were less productive than normal, forcing the animals to explore alternative food sources. We're seeing a fundamental shift in bear behavior that goes beyond normal year-to-year variations, Dr. Chen explained in her preliminary report. The animals are being forced to modify behaviors that have been stable for generations, and that adaptation process inevitably increases the likelihood of negative interactions with humans. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game implemented several new protocols in response to the Larsen Bay attack, including increased monitoring of radio-collared bears that showed patterns of approaching human habitation and enhanced public education programs focused on bear safety in coastal communities. However, budget constraints and the vast scale of Alaska's wilderness areas made comprehensive monitoring and response efforts extremely challenging. Mike Sanchez's body was transported to Anchorage for a complete autopsy and formal identification, though his injuries had made visual confirmation impossible. Dr. Patterson's detailed examination revealed the full extent of the trauma inflicted by Bear K247, documenting massive internal injuries that would have caused death within minutes, even with immediate medical intervention. The official cause of death was listed as multiple traumatic injuries resulting from a brown bear attack. The funeral service for Mike Sanchez was held at the Larsen Bay Community Center on June 28, 2025, exactly 1 week after his death. More than 200 people attended, including fishing crews from throughout the Kodiak Island region, colleagues from Peterson's Cannery, and members of the research community who had known Mike through his work with various wildlife monitoring projects. The service reflected both the grief of a community that had lost one of its own and the broader recognition that Mike's death represented a tragedy that could have befallen any of them. Father Michael Rodriguez, who had flown in from Kodiak to conduct the service, spoke about the unique challenges and rewards of life in Alaska's remote communities. Mike Sanchez came to Alaska seeking a fresh start, and he found it here among people who understood the value of hard work and the importance of community, he said. His death reminds us that we live in a place where nature is still in charge, where the wilderness that gives our lives meaning can also take them away without warning. But we honor Mike's memory by continuing to embrace that challenge, by supporting each other through the dangers and uncertainties that are part of life on the frontier. The investigation into regulatory and policy implications of the attack was led by Lieutenant Colonel David Harrison of the Alaska Wildlife Troopers, working in coordination with federal wildlife officials and university researchers. Their preliminary findings suggested that existing protocols for managing human-bear interactions were adequate for traditional conflict scenarios, but might need revision to address the changing behavioral patterns associated with climate-driven environmental changes. The incident at Larsen Bay represents a new category of human-wildlife conflict that our current regulatory framework wasn't designed to handle, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison explained in his testimony before the Alaska State Legislature's Natural Resources Committee. We're dealing with animals that are adapting to environmental changes in real time, and their behavioral modifications are creating risks that we're still learning to assess and manage. The economic impact of the attack extended beyond the immediate loss of Mike's fishing income and partnership stake in the Northern Grace. Tourism operators throughout the Kodiak Island region reported cancellations and inquiries about bear safety that suggested visitor concerns about wildlife encounters were affecting the broader economy. Commercial fishing operations also faced increased insurance costs and regulatory oversight that added to the financial pressures already affecting the industry. Captain Thompson's attempts to continue operating the Northern Grace with a replacement crew member proved unsuccessful, as the psychological trauma of the attack had affected his judgment and decision-making abilities in ways that made commercial fishing operations dangerous. After a near-miss incident involving a collision with floating debris that he failed to notice while lost in memories of his deceased partner, Thompson made the difficult decision to sell his boat and retire from commercial fishing. "I just can't concentrate out there anymore," Thompson admitted to his insurance adjuster during the claim process for his boat's sale. "Every time I look at that dock where Mike used to work, every time I'm out on the water in places where we fished together, I'm thinking about what happened to him instead of paying attention to what I'm doing. It's not safe for me or anyone else who might be working with me." Jimmy Kowalski left Alaska entirely 6 weeks after the attack, abandoning his plans for a career in marine biology and returning to Michigan to pursue graduate studies in environmental policy. The violent reality of Mike's death had shattered his idealistic vision of human-nature relationships and made continued work in the field impossible for him to contemplate. "I used to think that if you just respected the wilderness and understood animal behavior, you could coexist safely with anything nature threw at you," Jimmy explained in a letter to Dr. Reese, explaining his departure. "Mike's death taught me that sometimes respect and understanding aren't enough. Sometimes nature just kills you for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and there's nothing you can do about it except hope you're lucky enough that it doesn't happen to you." Indeed, The broader scientific community's response to the attack focused on the implications for bear research and management strategies throughout Alaska and other regions where brown bear populations interacted with human communities. The loss of bear K247 represented not just the end of a dangerous animal, but the elimination of several years of valuable behavioral data that had been contributing to long-term studies of climate change impacts on large mammal populations. Dr. Jennifer Rees's analysis of the incident became a cornerstone study in the emerging field of climate-driven human-wildlife conflict research. Her detailed reconstruction of the events leading to Mike's death, combined with historical data from Bear K247's tracking collar, provided insights into the behavioral modifications that were becoming increasingly common among Alaska's bear populations. The Larsen Bay incident represents a perfect storm of environmental factors that created conditions for a tragedy that might have been avoided under normal circumstances, Dr. Rees wrote in her final report. Climate change isn't just affecting wildlife populations through habitat loss or food scarcity. It's actually modifying learned behaviors in ways that increase the likelihood of dangerous encounters with humans. The legal proceedings that followed Mike's death were complex and unprecedented, involving questions of liability, regulatory compliance, and the adequacy of existing wildlife management protocols. Mike's ex-wife Sarah and their children Elena and Marcus initiated a wrongful death lawsuit against the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, arguing that inadequate monitoring and response to Bear K247's increasingly bold behavior had contributed to the fatal attack. The lawsuit alleged that research personnel had documented the bear's pattern of approaching human habitation without taking appropriate action to either relocate the animal or warn the Larsen Bay community about the potential danger. Defense attorneys for the state argued that bear behavior was inherently unpredictable and that existing protocols had been followed appropriately given the information available at the time. My client's ex-husband died because state officials knew they had a dangerous bear approaching a populated area and failed to take action to protect public safety, argued Portland attorney Rebecca Martinez, who had taken the case on behalf of Mike's family. The radio collar data clearly shows that Bear K247 had been moving closer to the village for weeks before the attack. Someone should have done something before it was too late. State wildlife officials defended their actions by pointing to the difficult balance between public safety and wildlife conservation that guided their decision-making processes. Bear relocations were expensive, time-consuming, and often unsuccessful, with many relocated animals returning to their original territories or creating problems in new areas. Euthanizing research animals based solely on proximity to human habitation would have undermined important scientific studies and set precedents that could affect wildlife management throughout the state. The case was ultimately settled out of court for an undisclosed amount, with the state agreeing to implement enhanced monitoring protocols for radio-collared bears that approached human communities. The settlement also included funding for improved bear safety education programs in remote communities and equipment upgrades for wildlife enforcement officers throughout Alaska. Media coverage of the attack was extensive and often sensationalized, with national news outlets focusing on the dramatic circumstances of the incident rather than the complex scientific and policy issues that had contributed to the tragedy. Television news segments featured dramatic recreations of the attack, interviews with bear safety experts, and discussions of the broader implications of climate change for human-wildlife interactions. The Discovery Channel produced a documentary about the incident titled Alaska's Killer Bears: The Larsen Bay Attack, which combined witness interviews, expert analysis, and computer-generated recreations to tell the story of Mike's death and its aftermath. While the program was factually accurate and respectful to Mike's memory, It contributed to a perception of Alaska as a place where deadly wildlife encounters were common and inevitable. Local media coverage was more nuanced, focusing on the impact of the attack on the Larsen Bay community and the broader implications for commercial fishing operations throughout the region. The Kodiak Daily Mirror published a series of articles examining the economic, social, and psychological effects of the tragedy, including interviews with community members who had known Mike personally and analysis of the policy changes being implemented in response to the incident. The long-term scientific implications of the attack continued to unfold over the months and years that followed. Bear greater than K247's necropsy revealed no obvious physical abnormalities or diseases that might have explained his unusual behavior, supporting theories that environmental factors, rather than individual pathology, had driven his aggression toward humans. Tissue samples from the bear were preserved for ongoing research into the effects of environmental toxins, dietary changes, and stress hormones on large predator behavior. Dr. Margaret Chen's continued analysis of bear movement patterns throughout Alaska revealed that the behavioral changes observed in bear K247 were part of a broader trend affecting brown bear populations across the state. Radio collar data from multiple research projects showed increasing incidents of bears approaching human facilities, spending extended periods in developed areas, and displaying reduced fear responses to human presence. We're witnessing the real-time evolution of bear behavior in response to environmental pressures, Dr. Chen explained during a presentation at the International Conference on Bear Research and Management. The traditional assumption that bears will avoid human contact when possible is breaking down as climate change forces these animals to adapt to new ecological realities. The psychological trauma experienced by the Larsen Bay community persisted long after the immediate shock of Mike's death had faded. Dr. Sarah Chen returned to the village multiple times over the following year to provide ongoing counseling support, noting that many residents continued to struggle with anxiety, hypervigilance, and disrupted sleep patterns that were characteristic of post-traumatic stress responses. Violent and unexpected death in a small community creates ripple effects that can persist for years, Dr. Chen observed in her follow-up reports. Everyone in Larsen Bay had some connection to Mike, either through work, social relationships, or simply the shared experience of living in an isolated place where everyone knows everyone else. His death didn't just affect his close friends and colleagues, it affected the entire social fabric of the community. Children in the village were particularly affected by the attack, with several elementary school students developing fears of outdoor activities and recurring nightmares about bear encounters. The school district brought in specialized counselors trained in childhood trauma to work with affected students, and outdoor education programs were modified to include enhanced bear safety training and psychological preparation for wildlife encounters. The physical memorialization of Mike's death took several forms over the months that followed the attack. The dock where he had been killed was rebuilt with enhanced lighting and emergency communication equipment, funded partially by donations from fishing communities throughout Alaska. A memorial plaque was installed at the site, commemorating Mike's life and his contributions to the Larsen Bay community, while serving as a reminder of the dangers that were part of daily life in Alaska. Peterson's Cannery established a scholarship fund in Mike's name to support young people from fishing families who wanted to pursue higher education while maintaining their connections to the maritime industry. The fund reflected Mike's own journey from failure and despair to rebuilding his life through honest work and community involvement, offering hope that others facing similar challenges might find their own paths to redemption and purpose. The broader implications of the Larsen Bay attack for wildlife management policy continued to evolve as scientists and policymakers grappled with the complex challenges posed by climate-driven changes in animal behavior. The incident became a case study in multiple academic disciplines, from wildlife biology and environmental science to psychology and public policy, each offering different perspectives on the factors that had contributed to the tragedy and the lessons that could be learned from it. Federal wildlife officials used the attack as justification for increased funding for climate change research and wildlife monitoring programs, arguing that understanding and predicting animal behavioral responses to environmental changes was essential for preventing future tragedies. However, budget constraints and competing priorities meant that these initiatives faced significant political and practical obstacles. The Larsen Bay incident shows us what can happen when we don't adequately monitor and respond to changing wildlife behavior patterns, testified Dr. Robert Chen, director of the National Wildlife Research Center, before a congressional subcommittee on natural resources. We need sustained investment in research and monitoring programs if we want to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The annual salmon run to Larsen Bay in the summer of 2026 brought back painful memories for the surviving members of the community. The dock where Mike had died was functional again, but many fishermen found themselves unable to work in the same location where their friend and colleague had lost his life. The economic impact was significant, as several boat crews chose to base their operations from other harbors rather than confronting the psychological challenges of working at the site of the attack. Captain Thompson, despite his retirement from commercial fishing, returned to Larsen Bay for the anniversary of Mike's death. He spent several hours sitting on a bench near the memorial plaque, watching other fishermen go about their work and remembering the partnership that had defined much of his adult life. His presence provided comfort to other community members who were struggling with their own grief and guilt about the attack. Mike would have wanted us to keep fishing, Thompson told a gathering at the community center that evening. He loved this work and this place, even though it cost him his life. The best way we can honor his memory is by taking care of each other and continuing the work that brought us all together in the first place. The scientific legacy of Bear K247 extended far beyond the circumstances of his death. Genetic samples from the bear contributed to ongoing research into the evolutionary adaptations that allowed Kodiak bears to grow larger than their mainland cousins, while his behavioral data informed computer models predicting how climate change might affect predator-prey relationships throughout the Arctic region. Dr. Jennifer Rees's comprehensive analysis of the bear's life history, published 2 years after the attack, provided unprecedented insights into the environmental and social factors that influence brown bear behavior in coastal Alaska. The study, titled Behavioral Adaptation and Human-Wildlife Conflict in a Changing Climate, Lessons from Bear K247, became required reading in wildlife management programs throughout North America. K247's story is ultimately a tragedy for both human and wildlife communities, Dr. Rees wrote in her conclusion. His death, along with Mike Sanchez's, represents the cost of our failure to adequately prepare for the rapid environmental changes that are reshaping ecosystems throughout the Arctic. We owe it to both their memories to do better in the future. The emotional healing process for Mike's family proved to be long and complicated. His ex-wife Sarah struggled with guilt over their divorce and the years of estrangement that had preceded his death, while their children, Elena and Marcus, found themselves grappling with complex feelings about a father they had barely known in his final years. Family counseling helped them work through these issues, but the violent circumstances of Mike's death created additional trauma that required specialized treatment. Elena, who had been pursuing a degree in social work at Portland State University, changed her academic focus to trauma counseling after her father's death. Her senior thesis examined the unique challenges faced by families of wildlife attack victims, drawing on her own experience as well as interviews with other survivors of similar tragedies. My father's death taught me that healing from trauma isn't just about dealing with grief. It's about learning to live with uncertainty and finding meaning in experiences that seem senseless, Elena wrote in her thesis. The randomness of what happened to him could have destroyed our family, but instead, it showed us the importance of supporting each other through the worst moments of our lives. Marcus, who had followed his father into the construction industry before Mike's move to Alaska, found himself drawn to Alaska despite the tragic circumstances of their final meeting. 2 years after the attack, he traveled to Larsen Bay to visit the site where his father had died and to meet the people who had known Mike during his final years. I needed to understand what drew him to this place and why he stayed here even when it was dangerous, Marcus explained to Captain Thompson during his visit. I think I get it now. There's something about Alaska that strips away all the bullshit and forces you to confront who you really are. My dad found himself here, even if it cost him his life. The technological responses to the Larsen Bay attack included the development of new early warning systems designed to detect approaching bears and alert human workers to potential danger. Motion sensors, thermal imaging cameras, and automated noisemakers were installed at fishing facilities throughout Alaska, creating networks of detection equipment that could provide advance warning of wildlife encounters. However, these technological solutions proved to be only partially effective, as bears demonstrated remarkable intelligence in adapting to and circumventing human detection systems. Some animals learned to approach facilities from directions that avoided sensor coverage, while others appeared to understand that certain types of human activity generated automated responses that they could ignore safely. Technology can be a valuable tool in reducing human-wildlife conflict, but it's not a complete solution, explained Dr. Mark Stevens, an engineering professor at the University of Alaska who had worked on several detection system projects. Bears are incredibly intelligent animals that learn from experience. Any technological system has to be constantly updated and modified to stay ahead of their adaptive capabilities. The insurance industry's response to the Larsen Bay attack and similar incidents throughout Alaska included significant increases in liability coverage requirements for commercial fishing operations and tourist businesses that operated in bear habitat. These increased costs created additional financial pressure on an industry that was already struggling with declining fish populations, increased regulatory oversight, and competition from large-scale commercial operations. Some smaller fishing operations were forced out of business by the increased insurance costs, consolidating the industry into fewer and larger companies that could absorb the additional expenses. This consolidation had negative effects on many coastal communities that depended on independent fishermen for economic stability and social cohesion. The bear attack didn't just kill Mike Sanchez. It killed a way of life that had sustained communities like Larsen Bay for generations, observed Dr. Patricia Williams, an economist at the University of Alaska who studied the fishing industry. The regulatory and insurance responses to the incident, while well-intentioned, have made it much harder for small operators to survive in an increasingly challenging business environment. The cultural impact of the attack extended beyond Alaska to influence how Americans thought about wilderness, wildlife, and the relationship between human civilization and the natural world. The incident became a symbol in debates about climate change, environmental protection, and the costs of human expansion into wild spaces. Environmental activists used the attack to illustrate the consequences of climate change for both human and animal communities, arguing that incidents like the one at Larsen Bay would become more common as environmental pressures forced wildlife to modify their traditional behaviors. Conservation groups incorporated Mike's story into fundraising campaigns and educational programs designed to promote action on climate change and habitat protection. Mike Sanchez died because we've disrupted the natural systems that allowed humans and bears to coexist for thousands of years, argued Jennifer Walsh, executive director of the Alaska Wilderness Alliance. His death is a warning about what happens when we push natural systems beyond their ability to adapt. We owe it to his memory to take action before more people die from our failure to address the environmental crisis. However, other groups used the incident to support arguments for increased wildlife control measures and reduced environmental protection in areas where humans and dangerous animals might come into contact. These voices argued that human safety should take precedence over wildlife conservation when the two came into conflict. The educational responses to the attack included the development of enhanced bear safety curricula for schools throughout Alaska and other regions with large bear populations. These programs combine traditional safety information with psychological preparation techniques designed to help people respond effectively to wildlife encounters without being paralyzed by fear. Dr. Linda Foster, an education specialist with the Alaska Department of Education, developed a comprehensive bear safety program that was implemented in schools throughout the state following the Larsen Bay incident. The program emphasized both practical safety measures and the psychological skills needed to function effectively in environments where dangerous wildlife encounters were possible. We can't eliminate the risk of bear attacks, but we can prepare people to minimize their chances of experiencing one and to respond effectively if they do encounter a dangerous animal, Dr. Foster explained. The key is providing realistic information without creating paralyzing fear that prevents people from enjoying the outdoors or participating in activities that are important to Alaska's economy and culture. The international scientific community's response to the attack included increased collaboration between researchers studying human-wildlife conflict in different parts of the world. The behavioral changes observed in Alaska's bear populations were compared to similar phenomena in other regions, experiencing rapid environmental change, creating a global database of information about how large predators adapt to human-altered landscapes. Research institutions in Canada, Scandinavia, and Russia initiated collaborative studies examining bear behavior modification in response to climate change, using protocols and methodologies developed in response to the Alaska incidents. These international partnerships provided broader perspectives on the challenges posed by changing wildlife behavior and potential solutions that might be applicable across different cultural and environmental contexts. The Larsen Bay attack was a local tragedy, but the underlying issues it represents are global in scope, explained Dr. Hans Eriksson of the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, who coordinated an international research consortium studying predator-human interactions. By sharing data and methodologies across national boundaries, we can develop more effective strategies for managing these challenges wherever they occur. Indeed, the spiritual and philosophical responses to Mike's death varied widely within the Larsen Bay community and beyond. Some residents found their faith strengthened by the tragedy, viewing it as part of a divine plan that human beings couldn't fully understand. Others struggled with questions about the meaning of suffering and the apparent randomness of death in the natural world. Father Michael Rodriguez returned to Larsen Bay multiple times in the months following the attack to provide spiritual counseling and to help community members process their grief within the context of their religious beliefs. His approach emphasized the importance of finding meaning in tragedy while acknowledging the reality of suffering in the world. Mike's death reminds us that we live in a fallen world where suffering and death are real, Father Rodriguez explained during one of his visits. But it also reminds us of the importance of community, of supporting each other through difficult times, and of finding ways to honor the memory of those we've lost by continuing to live meaningful lives ourselves. Native Alaskan spiritual leaders also provided perspectives on the attack that drew on traditional relationships between indigenous communities and the natural world. These viewpoints emphasize the importance of maintaining balance and respect in human interactions with wildlife, while acknowledging that sometimes the natural world could be dangerous and unpredictable. Elder Mary Koniag of the Alutiiq people, whose ancestors had lived on Kodiak Island for thousands of years, spoke at a community gathering about traditional approaches to understanding and preventing bear attacks. Her perspective emphasized the importance of reading environmental signs and maintaining spiritual connections to the animal world. Our ancestors knew how to live with bears because they understood that we share this land with them, Elder Koniag explained. The bears were here first, and they have their own ways of thinking and being in the world. When we forget that, when we act like we own the land instead of sharing it, that's when tragedy happens. The ongoing recovery process for the Larsen Bay community included the development of new traditions and rituals designed to help residents cope with the psychological impact of the attack while maintaining their connection to the place that defined their identity. An annual memorial fishing tournament was established in Mike's honor, combining remembrance of his life with celebration of the fishing culture that had brought the community together. The tournament also served practical purposes, bringing visitors to Larsen Bay, who contributed to the local economy while raising funds for bear safety equipment and education programs. The event became a model for other communities dealing with similar tragedies, showing how memorialization could serve both emotional and practical needs. Mike would have loved this tournament, Captain Thompson observed during the second annual event. He always said that fishing brought out the best in people, the patience, the persistence, the willingness to help each other out when things got tough. Having this event in his memory keeps those values alive in our community. The legal and regulatory changes that followed the attack continued to evolve as policymakers grappled with the complex challenges of balancing public safety, wildlife conservation, and economic needs in a changing environment. New protocols for monitoring radio-collared bears were implemented throughout Alaska, requiring more frequent position updates and immediate alerts when animals approached human facilities. However, these enhanced monitoring systems proved expensive to implement and maintain, particularly in remote areas where communication infrastructure was limited. Budget constraints forced wildlife officials to prioritize monitoring efforts in areas with higher human populations, potentially leaving some remote communities with reduced protection from dangerous wildlife encounters. The Federal Aviation Administration also implemented new regulations governing helicopter and fixed-wing aircraft operations in areas where wildlife darting and euthanasia operations might be conducted. These rules were designed to improve safety for both wildlife officers and pilots, but they also increased the time and cost associated with responding to potentially dangerous animal situations. The scientific understanding of bear behavior modification in response to climate change continued to advance as researchers analyzed data from the years following the Larsen Bay attack. Long-term studies showed that behavioral changes observed in individual animals like bear K247 were becoming more common throughout Alaska's bear populations, suggesting that the incident represented an early example of broader ecological shifts. Dr. Margaret Chen's follow-up research documented increasing incidents of bears approaching human facilities throughout Alaska, with radio collar data showing that average distances between bears and human habitation had decreased significantly over the 5-year period following the attack. These findings supported predictions that human-wildlife conflict would become more common as environmental pressures continued to intensify. The data clearly shows that the behavioral changes we observed in K247 were not anomalous, but rather indicative of broader population-level responses to environmental stress, Dr. Chen wrote in her 5-year follow-up study. We should expect to see more incidents like the one at Larsen Bay unless we develop more effective strategies for managing these evolving relationships between humans and wildlife. The economic analysis of the attack's long-term impact revealed both direct costs associated with the incident itself and broader economic effects that rippled through Alaska's tourism and fishing industries. Direct costs included emergency response expenses, investigation and legal proceedings, enhanced monitoring and safety equipment, and compensation to Mike's family through the legal settlement. Indirect costs proved to be much larger and more difficult to quantify, including reduced tourism revenue, increased insurance premiums, modified fishing operations, and the psychological and social costs borne by affected communities. Economic modeling suggested that the total cost of the incident, including both direct and indirect effects, exceeded $10 million over the 5-year period following the attack. Wildlife attacks represent a significant economic burden that extends far beyond the immediate costs of emergency response and investigation, noted Dr. Richard Anderson, an economist at the University of Alaska who studied the financial impact of human-wildlife conflict. The fear and uncertainty generated by incidents like Larsen Bay create lasting effects on business confidence, investment decisions, and community development that can persist for years. The technological innovations developed in response to the attack included improvements in bear deterrent devices, communication systems for remote workers, and rapid response protocols for wildlife emergencies. Several companies developed new products specifically designed to address the types of risks highlighted by Mike's death, creating a small but growing market for wildlife safety equipment. Motion-activated strobe lights, ultrasonic deterrent devices, and automated alarm systems were installed at fishing facilities throughout Alaska, with mixed results in terms of effectiveness. While some systems appeared to successfully deter bear approaches, others proved ineffective or were quickly overcome by the animal's adaptive intelligence. Personal safety devices also evolved, with new GPS emergency beacons, satellite communication systems, and bear spray delivery mechanisms being developed specifically for workers in remote areas. These devices provided some additional security for individuals working alone, but their effectiveness depended heavily on proper training and maintenance. The cultural memory of the attack became embedded in the folklore and shared narratives of Alaska's fishing communities, serving both as a cautionary tale and as a symbol of the courage required to live and work in dangerous environments. Mike's story was incorporated into the informal education process through which experienced fishermen taught newcomers about the realities of their profession. Young people entering the fishing industry learned about the Larsen Bay attack as part of their introduction to the risks and responsibilities of working in Alaska's waters and coastal areas. The incident became a reference point for discussions about safety protocols, risk assessment, and the psychological skills needed to function effectively in environments where deadly encounters with wildlife were possible. Every fisherman in Alaska knows Mike Sanchez's story, observed Captain Linda Stevens, who had worked the Kodiak waters for over 20 years. It's part of how we teach people to respect the environment they're working in and to understand that nature doesn't care about your plans or your schedule. That knowledge doesn't make the work easy, but it helps keep people alive. The scientific research infrastructure that developed in response to the attack created lasting improvements in Alaska's capacity to monitor and understand wildlife behavior. New research stations, Enhanced communication networks and improved data collection systems provided ongoing benefits for both wildlife management and broader ecological research. The University of Alaska established a new research center focused specifically on human-wildlife conflict, drawing faculty and students from multiple disciplines to study the complex factors that influence relationships between people and dangerous animals. The center became a national resource for research, education, and policy development related to wildlife management in human-modified landscapes. Federal and state funding for wildlife research increased significantly in the years following the attack, supporting expanded monitoring programs, enhanced safety training, and improved emergency response capabilities. While budget constraints limited the scope of these improvements, they represented important investments in understanding and managing the challenges posed by changing wildlife behavior. The international attention generated by the attack led to collaborations between Alaska researchers and scientists in other regions facing similar challenges with large predator populations. These partnerships facilitated the exchange of information, methodologies, and best practices for managing human-wildlife conflict in diverse environmental and cultural contexts. The personal stories of healing and recovery that emerged from the Larsen Bay community provided models for other groups dealing with similar tragedies. The community's approach to memorializing Mike while continuing to embrace the lifestyle that had attracted him to Alaska demonstrated that it was possible to acknowledge danger without being paralyzed by fear. Individual community members found different paths to healing, with some choosing to modify their work routines to reduce risk, while others maintained their traditional practices as a way of honoring Mike's memory. These varied responses reflected the community's recognition that there was no single correct way to process trauma and rebuild after tragedy. The children who had been affected by the attack grew up with a more realistic understanding of the risks associated with life in Alaska, but many also developed a deeper appreciation for the unique opportunities and experiences that remote living provided. Several young people who had known Mike chose to pursue careers in wildlife management, conservation, or related fields, inspired by their desire to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The environmental monitoring systems established in response to the attack provided ongoing data about the broader ecological changes affecting Kodiak Island and surrounding regions. This information proved valuable for understanding not just bear behavior, but the complex interactions between climate change, ecosystem health, and human activities in Arctic and subarctic environments. Temperature and precipitation data collected through the enhanced monitoring network documented the continuing warming trends that were affecting salmon migration patterns, vegetation growth, and the timing of seasonal events that influenced wildlife behavior. This information helped researchers understand the environmental context within which incidents like the Larsen Bay attack were becoming more likely. Ocean temperature and chemistry monitoring revealed changes in marine ecosystems that were affecting the food webs, supporting both salmon populations and the bear communities that depended on them. These data provided insights into the mechanisms through which climate change was creating the conditions for increased human-wildlife conflict. The policy recommendations that emerged from analysis of the attack emphasized the need for adaptive management strategies that could respond to changing environmental conditions and evolving wildlife behavior patterns. Traditional approaches to wildlife management based on historical behavior patterns and stable environmental conditions were proving inadequate for addressing the challenges posed by rapid ecological change. Regulatory agencies began developing more flexible protocols that could be modified quickly in response to new information about wildlife behavior or environmental conditions. These adaptive approaches required enhanced monitoring capabilities and improved communication systems, but they offered better prospects for preventing future tragedies while maintaining the economic and cultural activities that depended on access to wild areas. The legal framework governing wildlife management also evolved to address questions about liability, responsibility, and the balance between individual rights and public safety in situations involving dangerous animals. Court decisions related to the Larsen Bay case established precedents that influenced how similar cases would be handled in the future. The media coverage of the attack's anniversary each year provided opportunities for renewed discussion of the broader issues related to climate change, wildlife conservation, and human safety in wild areas. These annual retrospectives helped maintain public awareness of the challenges while showcasing the progress that had been made in developing improved management strategies. Television documentaries, newspaper articles, and online discussions of the attack continued to generate debate about the appropriate balance between human activities and wildlife conservation in a changing environment. These conversations contributed to broader public understanding of the complex issues involved, while honoring the memory of both Mike Sanchez and Bear greater than K247. The educational materials developed in response to the attack were adopted by schools and organizations throughout North America, extending the reach of lessons learned from the tragedy to communities far from Alaska. Bear safety curricula, emergency response protocols, and risk assessment methodologies developed for Alaska's unique conditions were adapted for use in other regions with large predator populations. The Memorial Scholarship Fund, established in Mike's name, continued to support young people from fishing families who wanted to pursue higher education while maintaining their connections to maritime industries. Recipients of these scholarships carried forward not just financial assistance, but also the values of hard work, community service, and environmental stewardship that had characterized Mike's life in Alaska. 10 years after the attack, the Larsen Bay community had developed a mature understanding of how to live with both the memory of the tragedy and the ongoing presence of the dangers that had caused it. The dock where Mike died remained a working facility, but it was also a place of remembrance where visitors could reflect on the complex relationships between humans and the natural world. The physical memorial to Mike had grown over the years to include contributions from fishing communities throughout Alaska and beyond, creating a shrine that honored not just his individual sacrifice, but the broader community of people who chose to live and work in dangerous environments because of their love for the wild places that still existed at the edges of civilization. Captain Thompson, now in his 80s and no longer fishing, continued to visit the memorial regularly, bringing flowers and spending quiet hours remembering his friend and partner. His presence served as a link between the tragedy and the community's ongoing life, demonstrating that it was possible to carry grief without being destroyed by it. Mike came to Alaska looking for a second chance, and he found it here, Thompson reflected during one of his visits. He died doing what he loved, in a place he loved, surrounded by people who respected him. There are worse ways to go, even if it was too soon and too violent. His life mattered, and the way he lived it after coming here showed all of us what it means to start over and build something meaningful from the pieces of a broken life. The scientific legacy of the attack continued to influence research and policy development related to human-wildlife conflict throughout the world. The detailed documentation of the incident, combined with extensive behavioral data from Bear K247, provided researchers with unprecedented insights into the factors that could transform a wildlife encounter from a manageable situation into a deadly tragedy. The database of information collected in response to the attack became a valuable resource for training wildlife managers, emergency responders, and community leaders who might face similar situations in the future. The lessons learned from Mike's death continued to save lives by improving understanding of bear behavior and enhancing preparedness for dangerous wildlife encounters. The story of Mike Sanchez and Bear K247 ultimately became more than just a tragedy. It became a case study in adaptation, resilience, and the ongoing challenge of finding ways for humans and wildlife to coexist in a rapidly changing world. Their deaths marked the end of two individual lives, but they also marked the beginning of a new understanding of the complex relationships that would define the future of life in the wild places that remained on Earth. In the end, the dock at Larsen Bay stood as both a memorial to the past and a symbol of the future, a place where the ancient rhythms of fishing and survival continued despite the knowledge that danger was always present, where humans chose to live and work at the edge of the wilderness because some things were worth the risk, and where the memory of Mike Sanchez served as a reminder that even in the face of tragedy, life could be meaningful, community could endure, and hope could survive.